Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Roman Insula, a towering, overcrowded apartment block where most of the empire's people lived. Picture flammable staircases, noisy neighbors, chamber pots tossed from windows, and walls so thin you could hear your neighbor's dreams. It was a place where sleep was more of a hope than a guarantee. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're standing in a quiet side street just off the Subura, one of the most crowded and chaotic districts in ancient Rome. The sky has darkened, and the sounds of the day are softening, but the city itself doesn't fall asleep. It changes. Voices rise from open windows, sandals scuff along the stones, and somewhere nearby, water sloshes from a bucket as someone finishes their last chore of the night. You are surrounded by towering insulae, the apartment blocks where the majority of Rome's population lived. Some of them rise 4 or 5 stories high, their upper floors sagging slightly from age and neglect. These buildings were never meant to last forever. They were built quickly and cheaply to meet the swelling demands of a growing city. The construction of these insulae tells a story of urban desperation and entrepreneurial greed. Developers, eager to maximize profits from Rome's housing crisis, used the cheapest materials available. The ground floors might boast stone foundations and brick walls, but as you ascend, the quality deteriorates with alarming speed. The upper stories often relied on timber frames, filled with cheap rubble and mud brick, creating structures that wobbled in strong winds and leaked in heavy rains. The architects of these buildings understood little about structural engineering, beyond the basic principle of stacking rooms atop one another. Load-bearing walls were frequently compromised by the addition of windows or doors, creating weak points that would prove catastrophic during earthquakes or fires. The wooden beams that supported each floor were often green timber, still damp from recent cutting, which would shrink and warp as it dried, causing joints to separate and floors to sag. At street level, the rooms are sturdier and a little more expensive. Shopkeepers and tradesmen might sleep behind their storefronts, close to the bustle and their daily earnings. These ground floor spaces serve dual purposes, functioning as workshops during the day and living quarters at night. A baker might knead his dough on the same table where his family ate their evening meal. A cobbler's last shared space with his children's toys. The scent of leather mixed with the aroma of cooking food, creating a unique signature for each establishment. But as you climb the stairs, the materials become more fragile, the air more cramped, and the feeling of safety slowly gives way to unease. Each step upward takes you further from the security of stone and closer to the precarious realm of timber and hope. The stairs themselves are often little more than wooden planks nailed to supports, with no railings to prevent a fatal tumble in the dark. The stairwell echoes with the sounds of dozens of lives lived in close proximity. A woman hums while mending clothes. Someone practices scales on a reed flute. The scratch of a stylus on wax tablets mingles with the rhythmic thud of a loom. These are the sounds of industry, of people making do with what they have, of life persisting in the margins of empire. Your own space is at the top. The rent is low, and so is the ceiling. You open the door to a small, windowless room that holds little more than a mat, a jug of water, and a clay oil lamp. The walls are thin and dry, patched with rough plaster that flakes when touched. Your lamp flickers against them, casting shadows that dance with every breeze sneaking through the cracked wood. The room itself is perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet. If you're fortunate, many are smaller. The ceiling slopes downward from the building's peaked roof, forcing you to duck in certain corners. A single small opening, not quite large enough to call a window, provides the only source of natural light and air. During winter, This opening might be covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters, plunging the room into near total darkness. Your possessions, such as they are, must be carefully arranged to maximize the limited space. A wooden chest might serve as both storage and seating. Clothes hang from pegs driven into the walls. A small brazier provides heat and a cooking surface, though its use requires constant vigilance to prevent disaster. The smoke from these braziers, multiplied across dozens of rooms, creates a permanent haze that stings the eyes and coats every surface with a fine layer of soot. The mat on which you sleep is likely stuffed with straw or rags, providing minimal cushioning against the wooden floor. In winter, you might add wool blankets if you can afford them, or simply wear all your clothes to bed. The wealthy inhabitants of grand villas could never imagine such conditions, but for the urban poor, this small space represents shelter and security, however modest. There is no running water, no private toilet, and no soundproofing. A child cries next door. A neighbor coughs in a slow rhythm that carries through the walls. Somewhere below, someone drops a pot and curses under their breath. The building itself creaks with every shift in the night air. The absence of soundproofing means that privacy is a luxury few can afford. Arguments between spouses become public entertainment. The intimate moments of courtship are shared, whether willingly or not, with surrounding neighbors. Children learn early to speak in whispers after dark, understanding that sound carries like water through the thin partitions. But sound also serves as a lifeline in these crowded spaces. The rhythm of familiar voices provides comfort and security. When old Marcus stops coughing in the room next door, neighbors know to check on him. When the baby 2 floors down cries inconsolably, other mothers offer advice through the walls. These buildings foster a strange intimacy among strangers, creating communities bound together by shared hardship and mutual dependence. The acoustic environment of an insula changes throughout the day like a complex symphony. Dawn brings the sounds of awakening, yawning, the splash of water on faces, the rustle of clothing. Morning erupts with the clatter of sandals on stairs as workers depart for their daily labors. Midday finds the buildings quieter, occupied mainly by the very young, the very old, and those whose work keeps them at home. Evening brings the crescendo as workers return, tired and hungry. Conversations flow through open doorways as neighbors share news of the day. The smell of cooking food mingles with the sound of sizzling oil and chopping knives. Children play in the narrow corridors, their laughter echoing off the walls. This is when the insula truly comes alive, when these collections of individual rooms briefly transform into something resembling a community. And then there is the smell. Smoke from cooking fires mixes with a damp scent of aged timber and human closeness. The latrines are shared, often located far away or downstairs in dark corners. If they're full or closed, tenants might empty their chamber pots out the windows, sometimes without warning. You learn quickly to hug the walls when walking near the alleys in the morning. The olfactory assault of an insula is something no modern person could easily imagine. The smell of unwashed bodies, cramped together in poorly ventilated spaces, creates a permanent funk that permeates every surface. Cooking odors linger in the air. The sharp tang of garum, the fish sauce that flavored most Roman dishes, the smoke from charcoal braziers, the occasional luxury of roasted meat when someone has managed to afford it. But perhaps more challenging than the human smells are the animal ones. Many tenants keep small animals, chickens for eggs, rabbits for meat, even small pigs if they can manage it. These creatures live in the same cramped spaces as their owners, adding their own contributions to the building's aromatic profile. The smell of animal waste mingles with human waste, creating a cocktail of odors that would drive most modern people immediately outdoors. The waste disposal system, such as it was, relied on a complex network of shared latrines and private chamber pots. The public latrines, when they functioned properly, were marvels of Roman engineering, with flowing water to carry waste away. But in the crowded insulae, these facilities were often overwhelmed, poorly maintained, or simply too distant to be practical for nighttime use. Chamber pots became a necessity, and their contents had to go somewhere. The practice of emptying these vessels out windows was so common that it became regulated by law, with specific penalties for those who failed to warn passers-by. The cry of "Aqua" was supposed to precede any such disposal, giving pedestrians time to seek cover. Still, accidents happened, and walking through Rome's poorer districts required constant vigilance. The alleys between insulae became repositories for all manner of waste. Broken pottery, rotting food, human and animal waste, and the occasional corpse of a pet or even a person who had died unnoticed. These narrow passages, barely wide enough for two people to pass, collected refuse like gutters collect rainwater. The smell was overwhelming, especially in summer when the heat intensified every odor. Fire is the ever-present danger. One forgotten flame or an overturned lamp could send the building up in smoke. Fires raced through neighborhoods in moments. It wasn't just the heat or the chaos, but the realization that no one was coming to help. Poor neighborhoods burned quickly, and rebuilding was slow. There were no fire escapes, no alarms, just the hope that you'd wake up in time to flee. The threat of fire haunted every resident of every insula. The combination of wooden construction, open flames for cooking and lighting, and cramped conditions created a perfect storm for disaster. Fires typically started in the upper floors, where the construction was weakest and the escape routes most limited. The narrow staircases, often the only way out, became death traps when filled with smoke and panicked residents. Once a fire took hold, it spread with terrifying speed. The dry timber construction provided perfect fuel, while the narrow alleys between buildings created wind tunnels that fanned the flames. Sparks leaped from building to building, turning individual fires into neighborhood conflagrations. The Great Fire during Nero's reign, which destroyed much of Rome, began in just such circumstances and demonstrated the vulnerability of the city's poor districts. The response to these fires was often tragically inadequate. Rome had no organized fire department in the modern sense, though Augustus did establish the vigils, a force of watchmen who were supposed to patrol the city and respond to fires. But these men were few in number and poorly equipped. Their primary tools were buckets, axes, and blankets for smothering flames. Against a major fire, they were nearly useless. The wealthy districts of Rome, with their stone construction and wider streets, were better protected. Private fire brigades, funded by rich citizens, guarded the expensive neighborhoods. But the insulae of the poor were largely on their own. When fire struck, residents had to rely on their neighbors and their own wits to survive. The psychological impact of living with constant fire danger cannot be overstated. Every night, as you settled down to sleep, you knew that you might be awakened by shouts of fire, echoing through the building. Every flame you lit for cooking or light carried the potential for disaster. The simple act of heating your room in winter became a calculated risk. Some tenants took precautions. They might keep a rope ladder by their window, though this was expensive and not always practical. Others formed informal networks with their neighbors, agreeing to wake each other if danger threatened. Many simply accepted the risk as part of life in the city, one more burden to bear in exchange for the opportunities Rome offered. The authorities' response to these recurring disasters was typically to issue new regulations. Laws were passed limiting the height of insulae, specifying the materials that could be used in construction, and mandating certain safety features. But enforcement was lax, and the pressure to maximize profits from limited urban space meant that most of these regulations were ignored. Still, people lived here, not for a night or two, but for years. They built lives in these small, dark spaces. Meals were prepared with whatever they had. Neighbors argued, shared stories, or kept to themselves. The upper floors were filled with families and workers, people who made the city move, even if they were mostly invisible to history. The resilience of these residents is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of life in the Insulae. Despite the dangers, the discomfort, and the constant uncertainty, people managed to create homes in these unlikely spaces. They formed relationships, raised children, pursued trades, and participated in the cultural life of the city. The Insula was not merely a place to sleep. It was a community, however fragile and temporary. Marriages were celebrated in these cramped quarters, with neighbors contributing what they could to the festivities. Children were born in rooms barely large enough to accommodate a midwife alongside the laboring mother. The dead were mourned in spaces where privacy was impossible, with the entire building sharing in the grief. These life events, which the wealthy celebrated in grand villas with elaborate ceremonies, were compressed into the intimate spaces of the Insula, made no less meaningful by their humble settings. The daily routines of Insula life required constant adaptation and creativity. Cooking, for instance, was an exercise in improvisation. With no kitchens and limited space for food storage, residents had to plan each meal carefully. Many relied on street vendors for prepared food, but this was expensive and not always reliable. Those who cooked for themselves used small portable braziers, carefully positioning them to avoid setting their rooms ablaze. Water had to be carried from public fountains, often located several blocks away. This simple task could consume hours each day, especially for those living on the upper floors. The clay jars used for water storage were heavy and fragile, making each trip a small adventure. In winter, when water sources might freeze, the challenge became even greater. Clothing care was another constant concern. With no closets and limited space for storage, garments had to be folded and stacked with precision. Washing clothes required a trip to the river or to public washhouses, where professional fullers would clean and press garments for a fee. Many residents owned only a few sets of clothes, wearing them until they literally fell apart. The social dynamics of Insula life were complex and ever-changing. Neighbors might become close friends, sharing resources and supporting each other through difficulties. But they might also become bitter enemies, with conflicts over noise, smells, or shared spaces escalating into violence. The thin walls meant that every argument was public, every reconciliation witnessed by dozens of listeners. Children growing up in these conditions learned early lessons about adaptability and resourcefulness. They played in the narrow corridors and on the flat rooftops, creating games that worked within the constraints of their environment. They learned to read the moods of their neighbors, understanding when to be quiet and when it was safe to make noise. These skills would serve them well in adult life, preparing them for the challenges of urban survival. The rhythm of seasons affected life in the Insulae profoundly. Summer brought unbearable heat to the upper floors, where poor ventilation and lack of insulation created oven-like conditions. Residents might sleep on the rooftops or in the streets, seeking relief from the stifling air. Winter brought different challenges, as the lack of proper heating made the rooms bitterly cold. Ice might form on the inside of walls, and water left in containers would freeze solid. Spring and autumn were the most pleasant seasons, when the buildings were neither too hot nor too cold. These were the times when social life flourished, when neighbors gathered in the courtyards and children played freely in the streets. The renewal of spring brought hope for better times ahead, while autumn's harvest brought the possibility of storing food for the hard winter months. The economic lives of Insula residents were precarious and unpredictable. Many worked as day laborers, never knowing from one morning to the next whether they would find employment. Others practiced small trades, selling goods from their rooms or working as artisans in the ground floor shops. Some were laborers or freedmen, working for wealthy masters who provided minimal support in exchange for their labor. The lack of economic security meant that every decision had to be weighed carefully. Spending money on better food or warmer clothing meant having less for rent. Falling behind on rent meant eviction and the prospect of sleeping in the streets. The constant pressure to earn enough to survive shaped every aspect of daily life. Women in the Insulae faced particular challenges. Those who worked outside the home might leave their children in the care of neighbors or older siblings. Others worked from their rooms, taking in sewing or laundry or selling food they had prepared. The lack of privacy made it difficult to maintain the modesty expected of Roman women. And the constant presence of unrelated men in the buildings created situations that wealthier women would never encounter. To someone from the modern world, used to insulation and indoor plumbing, the insula would feel unbearable. You might lie awake listening to every sound, feeling the floor shift, and wondering if the night would pass without incident. The darkness would press close, and sleep would remain just out of reach. The psychological adjustments required for insula life cannot be understated. The constant noise, the lack of privacy, the ever-present dangers, and the crowded conditions would overwhelm most people accustomed to modern living standards. The simple act of trying to sleep would become an ordeal as your mind processed every sound, every movement, every change in the building's creaking rhythm. The darkness itself was different in ancient Rome. Without electric lighting, night fell like a heavy curtain, broken only by the flickering light of oil lamps and the occasional torch. The quality of darkness was absolute in ways that modern people rarely experience. In your small room, with only a single clay lamp for illumination, the shadows seemed to move with malevolent life. The oil for these lamps was expensive, so most residents used them sparingly. This meant spending long hours in near total darkness, learning to navigate by touch and sound. The fear of running out of oil and being plunged into complete darkness was constant, adding another layer of anxiety to an already stressful existence. Sleep, when it finally came, was often fitful and interrupted. The thin walls meant that every movement in neighboring rooms was audible. The crying of babies, the coughing of the sick, the snoring of the exhausted, and the intimate sounds of couples created a symphony of human life that continued throughout the night. Learning to sleep through this cacophony was a skill that had to be developed over time. The physical discomfort of sleeping on thin mats on hard wooden floors added to the challenge. Without proper mattresses or pillows, residents had to make do with whatever padding they could afford. Straw-stuffed sacks served as mattresses, while bundles of cloth or even shoes might substitute for pillows. The cold of winter seeped through the walls and floors, while summer heat made the rooms unbearably stuffy. But for many Romans, this was simply life, a rhythm of survival woven into the fabric of the city. They developed coping strategies that modern people would find remarkable. They learned to find beauty in small things. The pattern of light through a crack in the wall, the sound of rain on the roof, the warmth of shared community. They created rituals and traditions that made their harsh circumstances more bearable. The concept of home took on different meanings in these crowded spaces. Home was not just a physical place, but a network of relationships, a shared understanding of how to live together in impossible conditions. The elderly woman who knew everyone's business became a source of community memory. The young man who could repair anything with scraps of wood and metal became invaluable to his neighbors. The mother who always had a bit of food to share with hungry children became a cornerstone of the building's social fabric. These communities were fragile and temporary. Economic pressures, fires, building collapses, and the constant churn of urban life meant that neighborhoods could disappear overnight. But while they lasted, they provided a framework for survival that went beyond mere physical shelter. They offered identity, purpose, and belonging to people who might otherwise have been completely lost in the vast anonymity of the imperial capital. The religious life of the Insula residents was often centered around small shrines and household gods. Without access to the grand temples of the city center, they created sacred spaces in their cramped quarters. Small niches in the walls held statues of protective deities. Offerings of food and wine were made to ensure the gods' continued favor. These private devotions provided comfort and hope in the face of daily hardships. The festivals and celebrations of the Roman calendar took on special significance in these communities. The Saturnalia, with its temporary reversal of social roles, allowed the poor to mock their betters and enjoy brief moments of freedom. The Lupercalia brought young men racing through the streets, their touch believed to bring fertility and good fortune. These celebrations provided breaks in the grinding routine of survival, moments of joy and community solidarity. Education for children in the Insulae was limited and informal. Few could afford proper schools, so children learned by observation and participation. Boys might be apprenticed to craftsmen, learning trades that would support them as adults. Girls learned domestic skills from their mothers and neighbors, preparing them for lives as wives and mothers. The lucky few who showed exceptional promise might catch the attention of wealthy patrons who would sponsor their education. The medical care available to Insula residents was basic and often dangerous. Professional physicians served the wealthy, while the poor relied on folk remedies, quack doctors, and the occasional charity of religious organizations. Common ailments like respiratory infections, digestive problems, and skin conditions were treated with herbs, prayers, and hope. More serious injuries or illnesses often proved fatal, not because treatment was impossible, but because it was unaffordable. The life expectancy of Insula residents was significantly lower than that of the wealthy. The combination of poor nutrition, unsanitary conditions, dangerous work, and limited medical care created an environment where death was a constant companion. Children died in infancy at appalling rates. Adults succumbed to diseases that would be easily treatable today. The elderly were rare and revered, their survival seen as evidence of divine favor or exceptional constitution. Yet even in the face of such hardships, the human spirit found ways to flourish. Art and literature emerged from these unlikely spaces. Street performers entertained crowds with songs and stories. Graffiti covered walls with jokes, love poems, and political commentary. The Insulae, for all their squalor and danger, were also places of creativity and cultural expression. The love affairs conducted in these cramped quarters were no less passionate for their lack of privacy. Young couples found ways to court and marry, despite the constant observation of their neighbors. Families celebrated the birth of children and mourned their deaths with the same intensity as their wealthier counterparts. The full range of human emotion played out in these small, dark rooms. The political life of the city touched the Insulae in complex ways. The residents were citizens, with theoretical rights and protections, but their poverty made them vulnerable to exploitation. Politicians courted their votes with promises of bread and circuses, temporary relief from the grinding poverty that defined their lives. The residents, in turn, learned to navigate the complex world of Roman politics, supporting leaders who offered the best hope for improvement in their circumstances. The transformation of Rome from republic to empire played out in the streets and alleys of the Insulae. The residents witnessed the rise and fall of emperors, the triumph of conquering armies, and the gradual changes that would reshape the Mediterranean world. They were both participants in and victims of these great historical forces, their lives shaped by events far beyond their control. The economy of the Insulae was largely invisible to the wealthy and powerful, but it was essential to the functioning of the city. The residents provided the labor that built Rome's monuments, cleaned its streets, and fed its population. They were the artisans who created the goods that filled the city's markets, the servants who maintained the households of the rich, and the soldiers who defended the empire's borders. Their contribution to Roman culture was equally significant, though often unrecognized. The street songs they sang influenced the music of the elite. Their stories and jokes found their way into the literature of the educated classes. Their religious practices blended with official Roman religion, creating the syncretic spirituality that would eventually evolve into Christianity. The insulae were also laboratories of social innovation. The residents developed new forms of community organization, new ways of sharing resources, and new strategies for survival in urban environments. These innovations would influence the development of cities throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The legal system of Rome, with its emphasis on property rights and formal procedures, often worked against the interests of Insula residents. Landlords could evict tenants with little notice. Employers could withhold wages with minimal consequences. The poor had limited access to legal representation and faced courts that were often biased against them. Yet they found ways to work within and around these systems, creating informal networks of mutual support and protection. The cultural life of the insulae was rich and varied, despite the material poverty of its residents. Storytellers shared tales of gods and heroes, while musicians provided entertainment with simple instruments. Dancing and singing were common forms of recreation, requiring no expensive equipment or special venues. These cultural activities provided psychological relief from the hardships of daily life and helped maintain social cohesion within the community. The dietary habits of Insula residents were shaped by poverty and convenience. Bread was the staple food, supplemented by whatever else could be afforded: olives, cheese, vegetables, and occasionally meat. Many residents relied on taverns and street vendors for prepared meals, since cooking in their cramped quarters was difficult and dangerous. The quality of food was often poor, leading to nutritional deficiencies and health problems. The clothing of the poor was simple and practical. Tunics made of rough wool or linen provided basic coverage, while cloaks offered protection from the weather. Shoes were a luxury that many could not afford, leading to frequent foot injuries and infections. The wealthy could be identified by their fine fabrics and elaborate styles, while the poor made do with whatever they could obtain through purchase, gift, or theft. The transportation available to Insula residents was limited to walking. The wealthy rode in litters or carriages, while the poor trudged through the streets on foot. This limited mobility meant that residents were largely confined to their immediate neighborhoods, rarely venturing far from their homes, except for work or special occasions. The geography of the city was experienced differently by different social classes, with the poor knowing the back alleys and shortcuts that the wealthy never saw. The entertainment available to the masses was carefully provided by the government and wealthy individuals as a means of maintaining social order. The circus games, gladiatorial contests, and theatrical performances offered temporary escape from the hardships of daily life. The residents of the insulae made up the majority of these audiences, their enthusiasm and approval essential to the success of these events. The religious life of the poor was often more intense and personal than that of the wealthy. With less to lose and more to fear, they turned to the gods for protection and comfort. Mystery religions, with their promise of salvation and afterlife rewards, found fertile ground among the residents of the insulae. The appeal of Christianity, when it finally reached Rome, was particularly strong among these marginalized communities. The seasonal rhythms of the city affected the insulae profoundly. Summer brought the threat of plague and fire, while winter brought cold and hunger. Spring offered hope for renewal and opportunity, while autumn brought the anxiety of preparing for another hard winter. These natural cycles provided a framework for life that transcended the artificial divisions of Roman society. The insulae were also places of constant change and movement. Residents moved frequently, driven by economic necessity, family obligations, or simply the desire for better conditions. This mobility meant that communities were constantly reforming, with new residents arriving as others departed. The social bonds that held these communities together had to be flexible and adaptable. The relationship between the insulae and the broader Roman world was complex and often contradictory. The residents were both essential to the city's functioning and marginalized by its social system. They were citizens of the world's greatest empire, yet lived in conditions that would have been considered barbaric by their own standards. This paradox defined much of their experience and shaped their understanding of their place in the world. Now, as we leave behind the worn staircases and shared walls, we step into a different kind of uncertainty. The same empire that housed millions in these precarious towers was itself about to face its own crisis of stability. The year 69 CE would bring chaos to the very heart of Roman power, as the carefully constructed system of imperial succession collapsed into violence and uncertainty. Ahead lies a moment in Roman history when even the emperors struggled to stay standing. One after another, men reached for the crown, only to lose it just as quickly. The streets grew tense, and loyalty shifted like sand in the wind. The residents of the Insulae, who had learned to live with daily uncertainty, would find themselves witnessing the spectacle of an entire empire struggling with the same fundamental question they faced each night. Who would survive until morning? The fires that threatened individual buildings would soon seem small compared to the conflagration that would engulf the entire Roman world. The thin walls and precarious construction of the Insulae would prove to be apt metaphors for the fragility of imperial power itself. In the taverns and alleyways where our Insula dwellers gathered, whispers would soon carry news of distant battles and political intrigue that would reshape the known world. The Insulae were also breeding grounds for superstition and folklore. In the absence of rational explanations for the hardships they endured, residents turned to magic and omens. A rat running across your path might signal impending disaster, while a bird landing on your windowsill could herald good fortune. Amulets and charms were worn to ward off evil spirits, and curses were whispered against landlords and creditors. The mysterious deaths that occurred regularly in these buildings spawned ghost stories that passed from tenant to tenant, each retelling adding new details to the supernatural mythology of the neighborhood. Professional fortune tellers and astrologers made regular rounds through the Insulae, offering hope and guidance to those who could afford their modest fees. These practitioners understood their clientele intimately, crafting predictions that acknowledged present hardships while promising future relief. Their services provided psychological comfort in an environment where control over one's fate seemed impossible, and their presence added an element of mystery and possibility to the otherwise grinding routine of survival. The black market economy thrived in the narrow passages between buildings. Stolen goods changed hands in shadowy alcoves, while illegal gambling dens operated in basement rooms. Prostitutes conducted business in rented corners, their services available to those who could afford them. These underground economies provided opportunities for those willing to take risks, but also attracted violence and exploitation. The authorities largely ignored these activities unless they became too disruptive or someone important complained. The relationship between different insulae created a complex urban geography of rivalry and cooperation. Buildings might develop reputations based on their residents' trades or origins. The insula housing mostly bakers might be known for early morning activity and the smell of fresh bread, while another dominated by metalworkers would ring with the sound of hammers and anvils. These specializations created informal networks of mutual support and competition that extended across the city. The physical deterioration of the buildings was a constant source of anxiety. Walls developed cracks that widened with each passing season. Roofs leaked, creating patches of damp that never fully dried. Floors sagged under the weight of too many occupants, and stairs loosened from their supports. Repairs were the landlord's responsibility, but most owners preferred to collect rent while investing as little as possible in maintenance. Tenants learned to live with decay, developing skills in temporary fixes and strategic avoidance of the most dangerous areas. The social mobility within the insulae was limited, but not entirely absent. A skilled craftsman might accumulate enough savings to move to a better room, or even purchase a small shop. A beautiful woman might attract the attention of a wealthy patron who would provide her with better accommodations. A clever child might catch the eye of a teacher or benefactor who would sponsor their education. These success stories, though rare, provided hope and inspiration to other residents who dreamed of escaping their circumstances. The role of women in these communities was complex and often contradictory. While Roman law granted women limited rights, practical realities of Insula life often expanded their influence. Women formed networks of mutual support that crossed building boundaries, sharing childcare responsibilities, medical knowledge, and survival strategies. They often managed household finances, negotiated with landlords, and maintained the social connections that held communities together. Their informal authority was recognized and respected, even if it lacked official recognition. The aging process in the Insulae was particularly brutal. The physical demands of daily life, combined with poor nutrition and inadequate medical care, aged residents prematurely. Those who survived to old age often did so by developing extensive networks of younger supporters who provided assistance in exchange for wisdom and experience. The elderly became repositories of neighborhood history, their memories serving as unofficial chronicles of the community's past. The impact of Roman military campaigns on the Insulae was profound but often overlooked. When legions departed for distant wars, they took with them sons, fathers, and husbands from these crowded buildings. The women left behind had to find new ways to support themselves and their children, often turning to cottage industries or service work. When soldiers returned, they brought with them foreign influences, new stories, and sometimes war wounds that required community care. The religious festivals that punctuated the Roman calendar were celebrated differently in the Insulae than in wealthy neighborhoods. Without access to expensive offerings or elaborate ceremonies, residents created their own traditions. Neighborhood festivals might feature communal meals where everyone contributed what they could. Religious processions wound through the narrow streets, with residents hanging cloth from their windows to honor the gods. These celebrations provided rare moments of joy and community solidarity that transcended the daily struggles of survival. The legal complications of Insula life were numerous and complex. Property disputes were common, as boundaries between rooms were often unclear and oral agreements were the norm. Inheritance issues arose when tenants died without clear heirs, leaving their few possessions to be fought over by neighbors and creditors. The death of a landlord could throw entire buildings into chaos as competing claims to ownership were sorted out, often leaving tenants in limbo about their housing security. The impact of weather on Insula life extended beyond seasonal discomfort. Heavy rains could flood lower floors, forcing residents to evacuate to higher levels that were already overcrowded. Strong winds could tear sections of roof away, leaving entire rooms exposed to the elements. Lightning strikes could start fires that spread rapidly through the dry timber construction. These natural disasters were accepted as part of urban life, but they added another layer of uncertainty to an already precarious existence. The development of unique architectural solutions within the Insulae reflected the ingenuity of their residents. Shared walls were opened to create passages between rooms, allowing families to expand their living space without paying additional rent. Roof spaces were converted into gardens where residents grew vegetables and herbs. Courtyards were covered with awnings to create additional living areas. These modifications were usually made without permission and could be undone quickly if landlords objected. The night shift economy of the Insulae was largely invisible to the daytime world. Night soil collectors emptied chamber pots and latrines under cover of darkness. Bakers began their work before dawn, filling the air with the aroma of fresh bread. Thieves and scavengers prowled the alleys, looking for opportunities. This nocturnal activity created a different rhythm of life that coexisted with, but remained separate from the daytime economy. The psychological coping mechanisms developed by Insula residents were remarkably sophisticated. They learned to compartmentalize their fears, focusing on immediate needs rather than long-term uncertainties. They developed rituals and routines that provided structure and meaning in chaotic circumstances. They created social roles and hierarchies that gave individuals purpose and identity within their communities. These adaptive strategies allowed them to maintain their humanity in dehumanizing conditions. The relationship between the insulae and the broader Roman economy was more significant than most Romans realized. The cheap labor provided by insula residents made possible the luxurious lifestyles of the wealthy. The goods produced in small workshops within these buildings supplied markets throughout the city. The taxes and rents collected from these properties funded public works and military campaigns. The insulae were not just housing for the poor. They were essential components of the imperial economic system. The cultural exchange that occurred within the insulae was remarkable for its diversity and intensity. Residents from different provinces of the empire brought their own traditions, languages, and skills. This mixing created new forms of art, music, and literature that would influence Roman culture for generations. The insulae were laboratories of cultural synthesis, where the diverse peoples of the empire learned to live together and create something new. Let's move gently into the year of the 4 emperors, a time when Rome itself seemed unsure of who would rule it next. Now imagine this city not just crowded and noisy, but uncertain. It's the year 69 CE, and the empire is holding its breath. Nero, the last of the Julio-Claudian line, has died by his own hand. His rule, which began with poetry and theater, had collapsed into fear, rebellion, and exile. And with him gone, the future is no longer clear. Picture Rome in those final days of 68 CE. The imperial palace, once filled with the sound of Nero's lyre and the applause of his terrified courtiers, now stands eerily quiet. The emperor who had dreamed of being remembered as the greatest artist of his age had instead become the most reviled ruler in Roman memory. His golden house, that sprawling monument to excess that devoured acres of the city's heart, suddenly seems less like a palace and more like a tomb. The news of Nero's death spreads through the city like wildfire, but it brings no celebration. Instead, there is a strange, unsettling quiet. In the Forum, where merchants usually hawk their wares with confident voices, conversations are hushed. People gather in small groups, whispering, wondering. For the first time in nearly a century, there is no clear successor. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled since Augustus first claimed the title of princeps, has ended not with ceremony, but with a dagger in a suburban villa. Across the empire, legions stir. In distant provinces, generals look toward Rome not just as a capital, but as a prize. The seat of power is open, and the temptation is too great. The Roman army, stretched across 3 continents, suddenly finds itself without a focal point. For generations, soldiers had sworn their oaths to the emperor, to the person who embodied Rome itself. Now that person is gone, and the machinery of loyalty begins to break down. In Britain, where legions fight against painted warriors in the northern mists, commanders receive word and pause their campaigns. Along the Rhine, where Germanic tribes probe the empire's defenses, officers gather in their headquarters and study maps not of barbarian territories, but of the roads that lead to Rome. But it is in Spain where the first move is made. Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, has watched Nero's decline with growing disgust. A man of old Roman virtue, or so he believes himself to be, Galba represents everything that Nero was not. Where Nero was young and artistic, Galba is old and stern. Where Nero spent freely, Galba counts every sestertius. Where Nero sought applause, Galba seeks respect. Galba comes first. An aging senator with a reputation for discipline, he is declared emperor by the Senate and welcomed by those who hope for order. But Galba quickly loses favor. He cuts costs, executes rivals, and refuses to pay the soldiers their expected bonuses. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's own elite protectors, begin to whisper. The march from Spain to Rome should have been a triumph. Galba's supporters paint his advance as a restoration, a return to the values that made Rome great. But from the beginning, there are troubling signs. The provincial legions that accompany him are not the disciplined force of legend. They are tired, homesick, and increasingly resentful. They had expected to be rewarded for their loyalty, perhaps even to be stationed in Rome itself, where the pay is better and the dangers fewer. Instead, Galba treats them like a necessary evil. He rations their food, limits their wine, and watches their every move with suspicious eyes. When they finally reach the capital, the soldiers find themselves quartered outside the city walls, close enough to smell the cooking fires and hear the laughter from the taverns, but forbidden from entering except on duty. The Senate, desperate for stability, confirms Galba's claim with unusual speed, but the senators who vote for him do so with reservation. They remember this man from his earlier career, recall his reputation for harshness and parsimony. Still, after Nero's excesses, perhaps harshness is what Rome needs. Perhaps the empire requires a firm hand to restore order. Galba's first acts as emperor seem to confirm this hope. He cancels Nero's most extravagant building projects, recalls wasteful expenditures, and begins to reform the imperial bureaucracy. The palace staff, grown fat and lazy under Nero's indulgent rule, suddenly find themselves working longer hours for less pay. Freedmen who had wielded enormous influence discover that their opinions are no longer sought. The new emperor surrounds himself with advisors who share his austere vision, men who speak of duty and tradition rather than pleasure and art. But Rome is not a province to be governed by simple decree. The city has its own rhythms, its own expectations. The people who cheer Galba's arrival soon begin to grumble. The games and festivals that Nero had provided, though costly, had given the masses something to anticipate. Now those entertainments are canceled or reduced. The public baths, which had been maintained at imperial expense, begin to fall into disrepair. Even the grain dole, that sacred promise to feed the poor, is administered with new strictness. More dangerous still is Galba's treatment of the Praetorian Guard. These men, the elite soldiers who protect the emperor's person, had grown accustomed to generous bonuses and special privileges. They lived in the heart of the city, enjoyed the best equipment, and saw themselves as the true guardians of Roman power. Under Nero, they had been well rewarded for their loyalty, even when that loyalty had been sorely tested. Galba sees them differently. To him, they are spoiled and potentially disloyal. He reduces their numbers, dismisses their most senior officers, and makes it clear that their privileges are not permanent. Most critically, he refuses to pay them the traditional donative, the special bonus that new emperors customarily distribute to secure their loyalty. It is a decision that will cost him dearly. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's own elite protectors, begin to whisper. In their barracks near the Palatine Hill, over cups of wine and games of dice, they speak of the old days. They remember Augustus, who had created their order and treated them with respect. They remember Claudius, who had paid them handsomely for their support. They even remember Nero, who for all his faults had never questioned their worth. Now they serve a man who treats them like common soldiers, who watches them with suspicion and speaks to them with contempt. Some of the older guards remember serving under Galba in Spain, recall his rigid discipline and his quick temper. They know that under this emperor, their comfortable life is at an end. Then comes Otho, ambitious and calculating. He bribes the guard and has Galba murdered in the Forum. The transition is not graceful. It is not ceremonial. It is sudden and sharp. One day Galba parades through the streets. The next his head is paraded on a spear. Marcus Salvius Otho had been waiting for this moment. A man of middle age and considerable charm, he had once been close to Nero, so close that rumors suggested he had shared the emperor's wife. That relationship had ended with Otho's exile to Lusitania, where he had served as governor and nursed his ambitions. When Galba's rebellion began, Otho had been among the first to join, hoping to position himself as the old man's successor. But Galba had other plans. Instead of naming Otho as his heir, the emperor had chosen Lucius Calpurnius Piso, a young aristocrat of impeccable breeding but little experience. The announcement had been made in the traditional manner, with ceremonies and sacrifices. But for Otho, it was a devastating blow. All his careful positioning, all his patient waiting, had been for nothing. Yet Otho was not a man to accept defeat quietly. He had money carefully saved from his years in Lusitania, and he had connections throughout the city. Most importantly, he understood something that Galba did not. In Rome, loyalty could be purchased, but it had to be purchased at the right price. The conspiracy that followed was swift and efficient. Otho's agents approached the Praetorian Guard with an offer that was impossible to refuse. Not only would they receive the donative that Galba had denied them, but they would receive it doubled. Furthermore, Otho promised to restore their privileges and to treat them with the respect they deserved. The response was immediate and overwhelming. On the morning of January 15th, 69 CE, Galba prepared for what should have been a routine ceremony. He planned to offer sacrifices to the gods and to address the people from the steps of the temple. It was the kind of public appearance that emperors made regularly, a chance to be seen and to demonstrate their piety. But as his litter carried him through the streets, something felt wrong. The crowds that normally gathered for such events were smaller than usual, and their cheers seemed forced. The Praetorian guards who escorted him walked with unusual tension, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding buildings. Even the weather seemed ominous, with dark clouds gathering over the 7 hills. The end came in the Lacus Curius, a small sacred area in the heart of the Forum. As Galba's litter approached the temple, a group of Praetorians suddenly broke ranks. They surrounded the emperor, their swords already drawn, their faces grim with purpose. Galba, caught completely off guard, had only moments to realize what was happening. Some accounts say he tried to bargain, offering even greater rewards than Otho had promised. Others claim he faced death with dignity, accepting his fate as the price of his decisions. What is certain is that it was over quickly. The emperor who had ruled for less than 7 months was dead, his body left in the dust of the Forum for all to see. The head that had once worn the laurel crown was severed and carried through the streets on a spear point. It was a grotesque spectacle, but also a message. The age of emperors who took their soldiers' loyalty for granted had ended. From now on, the throne would belong to whoever could pay the highest price. Otho becomes emperor, but peace doesn't follow. Far away in Germania, a man named Vitellius is gathering strength. His troops, loyal and eager for change, march toward Rome. Otho, desperate to hold on, meets them in battle. He loses, and rather than prolong the war or risk the lives of more Romans, Otho takes his own life. It is a strange moment of dignity amid the chaos. Marcus Salvius Otho's reign began with the kind of pageantry that Romans expected from their emperors. He distributed the promised bonuses, restored the Praetorian Guard to their former position, and made all the right gestures toward the Senate and people. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Rome might find the stability it craved. But news travels fast in an empire, and the legions stationed along the Rhine had their own ideas about who should rule. Aulus Vitellius, governor of Lower Germany, had been watching the events in Rome with growing interest. Unlike Galba, who had been driven by a sense of duty, or Otho, who had been motivated by personal ambition, Vitellius found himself pushed toward the throne by forces beyond his control. The Germanic legions were among the finest in the Roman army. They were hardened by constant warfare against the barbarian tribes, disciplined by years of frontier duty, and fiercely loyal to their commanders. When they learned of Galba's death and Otho's rise, they were outraged. They had supported Galba's rebellion, had expected to be rewarded for their loyalty, and now they found themselves ignored by the new regime. Vitellius himself was not a natural rebel. A man of enormous appetite and even greater indulgence, He was better known for his dinner parties than his military prowess. But he was also popular with his troops, who appreciated his generosity and his willingness to share their hardships. When they pressed him to claim the throne, he found it difficult to refuse. The declaration came on January 3rd, 69 CE, just 12 days before Galba's assassination. The Germanic legions acclaimed Vitellius as emperor in the traditional manner, raising him on their shields and shouting his name to the gray winter sky. But unlike previous imperial acclamations, this one was backed by immediate action. The legions began to prepare for war. The march from the Rhine to Rome was a massive undertaking. Vitellius commanded not just the Germanic legions, but also auxiliary troops from Gaul, Britain, and the Danube. His army, when fully assembled, numbered nearly 100,000 men, making it one of the largest military forces ever to march on the capital. But this was not a simple matter of military might. The soldiers who followed Vitellius were not just fighting for their commander. They were fighting for their vision of what Rome should be. They had spent years defending the empire's frontiers, watching wealth flow eastward to the capital, while they lived in crude camps and faced constant danger. Now they saw a chance to claim their share of Roman prosperity. The campaign that followed was brief but decisive. Otho, despite his wealth and his control of the Praetorian Guard, found himself outmatched by Vitellius's veteran legions. The two armies met at Bedriacum, a small town in northern Italy, on April 14, 69 CE. The battle was hard fought, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Otho's forces, hastily assembled and poorly coordinated, could not match the discipline and experience of the Germanic troops. The Praetorian Guard, for all their elite status, discovered that their ceremonial duties in Rome had not prepared them for a real battle against seasoned legionaries. By the end of the day, Otho's army was in full retreat. It was then that Otho made a decision that surprised everyone, including his own supporters. Rather than flee to Egypt or gather reinforcements from the eastern provinces, he chose to end the war immediately. On April 16, 69 CE, just 3 months and 5 days after becoming emperor, Marcus Salvius Otho took his own life. His final words, recorded by historians, spoke of his desire to prevent further bloodshed. He had seen what civil war could do to the empire, remembered the chaos that had followed Julius Caesar's assassination, and refused to be responsible for more Roman deaths. It was, as observers noted, a moment of unexpected nobility from a man who had gained the throne through treachery and bribery. Now Vitellius enters the city. His rule is marked by celebration, feasting, and excess. He throws games, offers gifts, and lives lavishly. But he is no more secure than those before him. Far to the east, in Judea, another general watches the unfolding drama. His name is Vespasian. Aulus Vitellius arrived in Rome as a conquering hero, but he entered a city that was already exhausted by months of uncertainty. The citizens who lined the streets to cheer his triumph were the same people who had welcomed Galba and mourned Otho. They were learning to be cautious in their enthusiasm, to hold back their emotions until they could be sure of the outcome. The new emperor seemed determined to erase the memory of his predecessor's austerity. Where Galba had cut expenses, Vitellius spent freely. Where Otho had been cautious, Vitellius was extravagant. The palace, which had been almost monastic under Galba's rule, suddenly came alive with banquets and entertainments. Vitellius's famous appetite became the talk of the city. He was said to eat 4 meals a day, each one a feast that would have satisfied a dozen ordinary Romans. His dinner parties were legendary, featuring exotic delicacies from across the empire, peacock tongues from Asia, dormice from Gaul, and wines from the finest vineyards of Campania. The emperor's table groaned under the weight of his indulgence, and his guests competed to match his consumption. But it was not just food that marked Vitellius's reign. He restored the public games that Galba had canceled, sponsored new festivals, and commissioned ambitious building projects. The amphitheater that would later become the Colosseum was still decades away, but Vitellius ordered the construction of temporary arenas where gladiators could fight and wild beasts could be displayed for the entertainment of the masses. The emperor also proved generous to his supporters. The Germanic legions that had brought him to power were rewarded with bonuses and privileges. Veterans were given land grants, and active soldiers received increases in pay. The Praetorian Guard, which had been dismissed by Galba and restored by Otho, was reorganized once again under Vitellius's command. Yet beneath the surface of celebration, there were troubling signs. The treasury, which Galba had worked to replenish, was quickly depleted by Vitellius's spending. The new emperor seemed incapable of saying no to any request for funds, whether it came from his generals, his friends, or his own desires. Within months of his arrival, the imperial finances were in crisis. More seriously, Vitellius's indulgence was beginning to affect his ability to govern. The emperor who had once been merely pleasure-loving was becoming dangerously gluttonous. His advisors found it increasingly difficult to get his attention, as he was often too drunk or too full to focus on matters of state. Important decisions were delayed or ignored entirely, and the machinery of government began to slow. But the most dangerous development was taking place far from Rome, in the eastern provinces, where another general was watching the unfolding drama with calculating eyes. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, known to history as Vespasian, commanded the legions engaged in the Jewish revolt. He was a man of very different character from the emperors who had preceded him, and he was beginning to attract very different kinds of supporters. Vespasian is practical, grounded, and well-liked by his troops. He declares himself emperor, and his legions begin the long march west. As they approach, Vitellius scrambles to hold on. He strengthens defenses, calls for allies, and begs the Senate for support. It isn't enough. Titus Flavius Vespasianus represented something new in Roman politics. Unlike the aristocratic Galba, the charming Otho, or the indulgent Vitellius, he was a man of the middle class, a soldier who had risen through merit rather than birth. His father had been a tax collector, his background was provincial, and his manner was straightforward to the point of bluntness. In the Rome of the Julio-Claudians, such a man would never have been considered for the throne. But in the chaos of 69 CE, traditional qualifications seemed less important than practical ability. Vespasian had been conducting the war in Judea with characteristic efficiency. The Jewish revolt that had begun in 66 CE had initially caught the Romans off guard, but under Vespasian's leadership, the legions had methodically reduced the rebel strongholds. By the time news of Nero's death reached the east, the general had already demonstrated his competence as both a military commander and an administrator. But Vespasian was also a cautious man who understood the dangers of premature action. While Galba, Otho, and Vitellius had rushed to claim the throne, he had watched and waited. He had seen how quickly emperors could fall, how easily popular support could evaporate, and how dangerous it was to move without adequate preparation. The decision to claim the throne came not from Vespasian himself, but from his supporters throughout the eastern provinces. The governor of Syria, Gaius Licinius Mucianus, was the first to openly advocate for rebellion. He argued that the empire needed a ruler who could restore order, someone who understood both warfare and governance. The prefect of Egypt, Tiberius Julius Alexander, soon added his support, promising to cut off the grain supply to Rome if necessary. Most importantly, Vespasian's own legions were eager for action. The soldiers who had followed him through the mountains of Judea were veterans of the toughest fighting in the empire. They had proven their loyalty under fire, and they trusted their commander's judgment. When he finally agreed to accept the purple, their enthusiasm was immediate and overwhelming. The formal declaration came on July 1st, 69 CE, in the ancient city of Alexandria. Vespasian, dressed in the simple tunic of a working soldier, was acclaimed emperor by his troops in the shadow of the great lighthouse. It was a moment heavy with symbolism, as the new emperor stood where Alexander the Great had once planned his conquests, where Cleopatra had ruled her kingdom, and where Roman grain ships began their vital journey to the capital. But unlike his predecessors, Vespasian did not immediately march on Rome. Instead, he divided his forces, sending his son Titus to complete the siege of Jerusalem, while he himself secured the eastern provinces. The general who had spent years planning military campaigns was now planning a political one, and he intended to be thorough. The key to Vespasian's strategy was control of Egypt. The province was the empire's breadbasket, providing much of the grain that fed the Roman masses. By holding Egypt, Vespasian could starve the capital into submission without firing a shot. It was a strategy that demonstrated both his understanding of logistics and his reluctance to spill Roman blood unnecessarily. Word of Vespasian's rebellion reached Rome in late summer, just as Vitellius was celebrating what he thought was his secure hold on power. The news came as a shock to the emperor, who had been so focused on his pleasures that he had ignored the warning signs from the east. Suddenly, the man who had seemed so confident appeared confused and uncertain. Vitellius's response revealed both his weaknesses and his limited understanding of the situation. He began by trying to dismiss the rebellion as a minor disturbance, claiming that Vespasian was just another ambitious general who would soon be defeated. But as more reports arrived, describing the extent of Eastern support for the challenger, the emperor's confidence began to crumble. The measures that Vitellius took to defend his position were half-hearted and poorly coordinated. He recalled some legions from the frontiers, but not enough to make a real difference. He attempted to negotiate with potential allies, but his reputation for excess made him a questionable partner. Most damagingly, he tried to solve his problems through the same methods that had created them, spending even more money to buy support that was no longer for sale. By the end of the year, Vespasian's supporters have taken the city. Vitellius is dragged from hiding and killed. The streets are stained with conflict, and the forum echoes with uneasy quiet. The final act of the drama began not in Rome, but in the Danube provinces, where the legions stationed along the river had declared for Vespasian. Led by Marcus Antonius Primus, a capable but ruthless commander, these troops began marching toward Italy in early autumn. Unlike Vitellius's leisurely advance months earlier, this was a rapid, focused campaign designed to end the war before winter set in. The decisive battle came once again at Bedriacum, a small town that had already witnessed Otho's defeat. On October 24th, 69 CE, Vitellius's forces met the Danubian legions in a contest that would determine the fate of the empire. The battle was fierce, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Vitellius's troops, softened by months of easy living in Rome, could not match the discipline and determination of their opponents. The defeat at Bedriacum was more than a military setback. It was a psychological collapse. Vitellius, who had seemed so confident just months earlier, suddenly found himself abandoned by his supporters. The Senate, which had acclaimed him as emperor, now began to consider how best to accommodate his successor. The Praetorian Guard, which had already changed sides 3 times in a single year, prepared to do so again. But Vitellius was not ready to surrender. As news of the defeat reached Rome, he attempted to rally support for a final defense of the capital. He called upon the urban cohorts, the firefighters, and even the gladiators to take up arms. He promised enormous rewards to anyone who would stand with him, and he threatened terrible punishments for those who would not. The response was disappointing. The people of Rome, exhausted by a year of civil war, had no enthusiasm for further fighting. The soldiers who remained loyal to Vitellius were too few to make a difference. Even the emperor's own supporters began to drift away, seeking accommodation with the approaching victors. In desperation, Vitellius attempted to negotiate. He offered to abdicate in favor of Vespasian, to retire to private life, to give up all his claims to power. But it was too late for such gestures. The forces of change had acquired their own momentum. and there was no stopping them now. The end came on December 20th, 69 CE, as Vespasian's supporters fought their way into the heart of Rome. The city that had been spared the worst horrors of civil war suddenly found itself a battlefield. The Capitoline Hill, sacred center of Roman religion, was set ablaze. The temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, symbol of Roman power, was destroyed. The streets that had witnessed so many triumphs now ran with blood. Vitellius, abandoned by his guards and hunted by his enemies, attempted to hide in the palace that had been his home for less than a year. But there was no sanctuary for a deposed emperor. He was found, dragged from his hiding place, and killed with the same brutality that had marked the entire year. His body was thrown into the Tiber, and his head was paraded through the streets, just as Galba's had been 11 months earlier. All of this has unfolded in the space of a single year. 4 emperors, each rising and falling in quick succession. The empire, though vast and ancient in our minds, has revealed how fragile it truly is. Beneath the marble and tradition lies a system easily swayed by ambition, rumor, and the will of the legions. The statistics are staggering when viewed from the perspective of historical time. In the space of 12 months, Rome had witnessed the deaths of 4 emperors, the destruction of its most sacred buildings, and the collapse of the political system that had maintained order for nearly a century. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled since Augustus, was not merely ended but obliterated. The principle of hereditary succession, which had seemed so natural and necessary, was revealed to be nothing more than a convenient fiction. The legions that had once been the empire's strength had become its greatest weakness. Throughout the provinces, military commanders now understood that imperial power was theirs for the taking, provided they could muster sufficient force and maintain the loyalty of their troops. The old idea that emperors were chosen by the gods, confirmed by the Senate, and accepted by the people, had been replaced by a simpler and more brutal reality. The throne belonged to whoever could seize it and hold it. Yet perhaps most remarkably, the empire itself had endured. Despite the chaos at its center, the provinces had continued to function. The frontiers had been maintained, and the complex system of trade and administration had kept operating. The barbarian tribes beyond the borders had not taken advantage of Roman weakness, perhaps because they did not fully understand what was happening. The Jewish revolt in the east had continued, but it had not spread. The grain ships from Egypt had kept sailing, the tax collectors had kept working, and the soldiers had kept fighting. For the average Roman, it is a confusing and frightening time. The coins in their pockets change faces. Laws are issued and repealed. One day a festival is held in celebration. The next a curfew is ordered. Soldiers pass through the streets in unfamiliar armor. People lower their voices in markets, unsure which name is safe to speak. The psychological impact of the year's events extended far beyond the political elite. For ordinary Romans, the rapid succession of emperors had shattered their sense of permanence and security. The coins that they handled daily, each bearing the image of a different ruler, served as constant reminders of the instability at the heart of their world. Money changers in the Forum found themselves dealing with currencies that might be worthless by the end of the week. The legal system, which had provided a framework for daily life, became increasingly unreliable. Laws passed by one emperor were frequently overturned by his successor. Court cases that had been decided under one regime were reopened under another. Contracts and agreements that had seemed secure suddenly became matters of dispute. The whole structure of Roman law, built up over centuries of careful precedent, was undermined by the rapid changes at the top. Religious life, too, was affected by the uncertainty. The traditional Roman calendar was filled with festivals and ceremonies that honored the emperor as well as the gods. But which emperor should be honored? The priests who conducted the public rituals found themselves in an impossible position, required to celebrate rulers who might be dead or deposed by the time the ceremonies were completed. Some temples simply closed their doors. waiting for the situation to stabilize. The streets of Rome themselves became a kind of theater where the drama of imperial politics was played out in real time. Soldiers from different legions, wearing different uniforms and carrying different standards, passed through the city in confusing succession. Citizens learned to read the signs, to recognize which unit supported which emperor, and to adjust their behavior accordingly. A cheer for the wrong general could be dangerous. Silence might be interpreted as disloyalty. Markets and shops, the economic lifeblood of the city, struggled to adapt to the changing circumstances. Merchants who had invested heavily in goods associated with one emperor found themselves stuck with worthless inventory when he fell. The luxury trades that had flourished under Nero, declined under Galba, revived under Vitellius, were particularly vulnerable to these rapid reversals. Craftsmen who had specialized in imperial portraits found themselves constantly reworking their molds and dyes. And yet, life continues. Bakers still rise before dawn. Merchants still haggle. Children still play with sticks and stones in the dust outside their homes. Most citizens never see an emperor. Their lives are touched by these changes only when war enters the city or taxes rise again. The resilience of ordinary Romans during this period is perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire crisis. While the political world collapsed around them, the people of the city continued to live their lives with remarkable normalcy. The daily routines that had sustained Rome for centuries proved stronger than the ambitions of individual rulers. In the Subura, the crowded working-class district that sprawled across the lower slopes of the Esquiline Hill, life went on much as it always had. The apartment buildings, tall and precarious, continued to house their teeming populations. The taverns and brothels that lined the narrow streets remained open for business. The workshops where craftsmen produced everything from pottery to jewelry kept operating, their owners adapting to changing circumstances with the flexibility that had always characterized the Roman commercial class. The great aqueducts that brought water to the city continued to function, maintained by engineers who understood that their work was more important than politics. The sewers that carried away the city's waste kept flowing, tended by workers who cared more about public health than imperial succession. The fire brigades that protected Rome from the constant threat of conflagration remained at their posts, ready to respond to emergencies, regardless of who wore the purple. Women, who had no formal role in the political system, often found themselves serving as bridges between different factions. The wives and daughters of senators, the female relatives of military commanders, the women who ran businesses and managed households, all played important roles in maintaining the social networks that held the city together. They carried messages, negotiated agreements, and provided the personal connections that made political accommodation possible. Children, too, continued their normal activities despite the chaos around them. They played in the streets, attended school, and learned the skills that would serve them in adult life. For them, the rapid changes in imperial succession were simply part of the background noise of urban life, no more significant than the daily comings and goings of their parents. Only later would they realize that they had lived through one of the most remarkable years in Roman history. The year of the 4 emperors becomes a cautionary tale. It reminds Rome and those watching from afar that power is fleeting and loyalty is fragile. When the dust settles, Vespasian begins to rebuild. He brings stability, begins construction of the Colosseum, and establishes a new dynasty. The lessons of 69 CE were not lost on the man who finally emerged as the survivor. Vespasian, unlike his predecessors, understood that ruling Rome required more than just military force or political maneuvering. It required the ability to restore confidence in the system itself, to convince the people that the chaos was over and that normal life could resume. His first acts as emperor were designed to signal this return to normalcy. He rebuilt the Capitoline Temple that had been destroyed during the fighting, not just as a religious gesture, but as a symbol of continuity with the past. He reformed the military, ensuring that no single commander could again threaten the stability of the state. He rationalized the finances, bringing order to the chaotic fiscal situation that had contributed to the crisis. But perhaps most importantly, Vespasian began the construction of the Phlegon Amphitheater, the building that would later be known as the Colosseum. This massive project, built on the site of Nero's Golden House, was more than just an entertainment venue. It was a statement about the kind of Emperor Vespasian intended to be: practical, generous to the people, and focused on lasting achievements rather than personal gratification. The new dynasty that Vespasian established would rule for 27 years, bringing the stability that had been so lacking during the crisis. But the memory of 69 CE would continue to influence Roman politics for generations to come. The idea that the army, rather than birth or senatorial approval, was the ultimate source of imperial power had been firmly established. Future emperors would ignore this lesson at their peril. The year also demonstrated the remarkable resilience of the Roman system. Despite the chaos at the center, the empire had not collapsed. The provinces had remained loyal, the frontiers had been defended, and the economic system had continued to function. This resilience would serve Rome well in the centuries to come, as the empire faced challenges that made the crisis of 69 CE seem minor by comparison. But for that one chaotic year, the empire was balanced on a knife's edge, not ruled by vision or virtue, but by whoever could hold it the longest. The metaphor of the knife's edge is particularly apt when considering how close Rome came to complete collapse. Had the civil war continued for another year, had the eastern provinces broken away entirely, had the barbarian tribes taken advantage of Roman weakness, the history of the world might have been very different. The empire that would later produce Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, that would preserve Greek learning and spread Roman law, that would provide the context for the rise of Christianity, came perilously close to ending before it had reached its full potential. The personalities of the four emperors also provided a study in the varieties of human ambition and failure. Galba, the stern disciplinarian who forgot that leadership requires more than just authority. Otho, the charming politician who discovered that charm alone could not win battles. Vitellius, the indulgent hedonist who proved that generosity without discipline leads to ruin. And finally Vespasian, the practical soldier who understood that survival required not just strength, but wisdom. Each man brought different qualities to the throne, and each failed or succeeded for different reasons. But together, they demonstrated that the Roman Empire had outgrown the simple system of personal rule that had worked for Augustus and his immediate successors. The empire now required institutions that could function regardless of the personality of the individual emperor, systems that could survive the death or incompetence of any single ruler. The year 69 CE also marked a turning point in Roman social development. The idea that emperors had to be aristocrats, that they had to trace their lineage back to the ancient families of the Republic, was finally abandoned. Vespasian's success proved that merit could triumph over birth, that a man from the provinces could rule as effectively as a descendant of the Iuli or Claudi. This democratization of imperial power, though still limited to the military and political elite, represented a significant expansion of opportunities within the Roman system. The crisis also demonstrated the growing importance of the provinces in imperial politics. No longer were they simply sources of revenue and manpower for the capital. They had become power centers in their own right, capable of making and breaking emperors. The legions stationed on the frontiers, far from the corrupting influences of Rome, had proven themselves more disciplined and effective than the pampered Praetorian Guard. This shift in the balance of power would have profound implications for the future development of the empire. The economic lessons of the year were equally important. The rapid depletion of the treasury under Vitellius had shown how quickly imperial finances could collapse when spending was not controlled. The disruption of trade routes during the Civil War had demonstrated the interconnectedness of the Roman economy and the importance of maintaining stability throughout the empire. These lessons would influence imperial fiscal policy for generations to come. Religious and cultural life in Rome was also permanently changed by the events of 69 CE. The destruction of the Capitoline Temple had been a profound shock to Roman religious sensibilities. But its reconstruction under Vespasian had shown that even the most sacred traditions could be renewed and revitalized. The imperial cult, which had developed around the person of Augustus, had proven surprisingly adaptable to rapid changes in leadership. The Roman capacity for religious innovation and adaptation, always one of their greatest strengths, had been severely tested, but ultimately confirmed. The year had also seen the emergence of new forms of political communication and propaganda. The rapid spread of news throughout the empire, the importance of controlling information, and the power of rumor and speculation in shaping public opinion had all been demonstrated during the crisis. Future emperors would need to be as skilled in managing information as they were in commanding armies or governing provinces. Perhaps most significantly, the year of the four emperors had established a new model for imperial transition. The idea that emperors should die peacefully in their beds and be succeeded by their chosen heirs had proven to be unrealistic. Instead, the empire had shown that it could survive violent changes in leadership, that the system was robust enough to endure even the most chaotic circumstances. This resilience would be tested many times in the centuries to come, but the precedent had been established. The international implications of the crisis were also significant. Foreign powers watching from beyond the Roman borders had seen the empire's vulnerability, but also its strength. The Parthians in the east, the Germanic tribes in the north, and the various kingdoms of Africa had all observed the civil war with interest. Some perhaps hoping for Roman collapse, others fearing the consequences of imperial disintegration. The fact that Rome had emerged from the crisis stronger and more unified than before sent a clear message about the empire's fundamental stability. The psychological impact of the year extended far beyond Rome itself. Throughout the provinces, people had watched the events in the capital with a mixture of fascination and fear. The rapid succession of emperors had forced provincial populations to confront the reality of imperial politics, to understand that their fate was tied to events taking place thousands of miles away. This awareness of their place in a larger political system would influence provincial attitudes toward Rome for generations to come. The military lessons of the year were perhaps the most immediately practical. The superiority of frontier legions over city troops, the importance of veteran leadership, and the decisive role of logistics in campaign success had all been demonstrated. These lessons would be incorporated into Roman military doctrine and would influence the empire's approach to warfare for centuries to come. The year had also shown the importance of political timing and the dangers of hesitation. Galba's delay in securing the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, Otho's failure to adequately prepare for war, and Vitellius's inability to respond effectively to the Eastern threat had all contributed to their downfall. Vespasian's success, by contrast, had been built on careful preparation and decisive action at the crucial moment. The role of individual personality in shaping historical events had been starkly illustrated by the contrasting fates of the four emperors. Each man had faced similar challenges, but their different responses had led to very different outcomes. This demonstration of the importance of character and decision-making in leadership would become a standard topic in Roman education and political discourse. The year had also established new precedents for the treatment of defeated emperors. The brutal deaths of Galba, Otho, and Vitellius had shown that imperial dignity provided no protection against political failure. This reality would influence the behavior of future emperors, making them more cautious, but also more ruthless in their efforts to maintain power. Now, as we leave behind the marble halls of politics and the bloody contests of ambition, we'll move towards something quieter, something smaller, but no less revealing. The transition from the grand stage of imperial politics to the intimate world of every day. Life represents more than just a change of scene. It reflects a fundamental truth about historical understanding, that the great events which dominate our attention are often less revealing than the small details which we tend to overlook. The Year of the Four Emperors tells us about the mechanics of power, the fragility of institutions, and the role of force in politics. But it tells us relatively little about how ordinary people lived, what they thought, and how they saw their world. The marble halls of the imperial palaces, for all their grandeur, were inhabited by a tiny elite whose concerns and perspectives were often far removed from those of the common people. The bloody contests of ambition that determined who would rule the empire were fought by men whose lives were shaped by wealth, education, and access to power. But the vast majority of Romans lived very different lives, in very different circumstances, with very different priorities and concerns. To understand the full richness of Roman civilization, we need to look beyond the dramatic events that captured the attention of ancient historians. We need to examine the mundane details of daily life, the casual comments and observations that reveal how people actually thought and felt. We need to listen to voices that were never intended to be preserved for posterity, to read words that were written not for history, but for the moment. Fortunately, such voices still exist. In the buried cities of Campania, beneath layers of volcanic ash and pumice, archaeologists have uncovered a treasure trove of everyday Roman life. The walls of houses, shops, and public buildings are covered with inscriptions, drawings, and graffiti that provide an unfiltered glimpse into the minds of ordinary Romans. These casual scribblings, preserved by the very disaster that destroyed their creators, offer us something that no imperial biography or senatorial history can provide: direct access to the thoughts and feelings of real people. Ahead lies a city frozen in time, its walls still whispering the thoughts and humor of everyday Romans. We'll walk among the ruins of Pompeii and read the words they left behind, etched in stone and preserved beneath ash. The city that awaits us is unique in the ancient world, a place where time stopped suddenly and completely on a summer day in 79 CE, while Rome continued to evolve and change. While the great monuments of the capital were rebuilt and redesigned countless times, Pompeii remained exactly as it was in the moment of its destruction. The houses still contain the furniture and household goods of their inhabitants. The shops still display the wares they were selling. The streets still bear the marks of cartwheels and the wear patterns of pedestrian traffic. But most remarkably, the walls of Pompeii still bear the words of its people. Scratched into plaster, carved into stone, painted in bright colors for all to see, these inscriptions provide an unparalleled record of Roman life and thought. They range from the profound to the profane, from political slogans to love letters, from business advertisements to crude jokes. They represent the full spectrum of human experience, captured in the moment and preserved for eternity. These are not the carefully crafted words of professional writers or the polished phrases of political speeches. They are the spontaneous expressions of real people, written in the heat of the moment, without thought for posterity or literary effect. They reveal not just what Romans did, but what they thought while they were doing it. They show us not just the public face of Roman civilization, but its private thoughts and hidden feelings. In walking through the streets of Pompeii, we will encounter voices that span the entire social spectrum of Roman society. We will hear from laborers and freedmen, from shopkeepers and aristocrats, from gladiators and prostitutes, from local politicians and visiting tourists. We will discover that the Romans were not the marble statues that populate our museums, but flesh and blood human beings with all the hopes, fears, desires, and frustrations that have always characterized human existence. The graffiti of Pompeii will show us that Romans could be just as petty, just as romantic, just as ambitious, and just as foolish as people in any age. They will reveal that beneath the grand narratives of imperial politics and military conquest, ordinary Romans lived lives that were remarkably similar to our own. They fell in love, worried about money, gossiped about their neighbors, and tried to make sense of a world that often seemed chaotic and unpredictable. As we prepare to enter this preserved world, we leave behind the realm of public history and enter the domain of private life. We move from the grand stage, where emperors performed their roles, to the intimate spaces where ordinary people lived their lives. We exchange the marble and bronze of official monuments for the simple plaster and paint of everyday walls. We trade the carefully constructed narratives of professional historians for the eyes, spontaneous expressions of people who never expected their words to survive. Let's continue. As we leave behind the political storms of Rome, we arrive at a place suspended in silence. Pompeii. The sun is high, and the streets are empty, though they look as if someone might round the corner at any moment. Stone roads still hold the grooves from wagon wheels. Archways stand half-shattered. There are market stalls, bakeries, fountains, and doorways that lead into rooms no one has entered for centuries. But it isn't the architecture that holds us here tonight. It's the voices. Not grand speeches or epic poetry, but the quiet, offhand things people said when no one was listening. Messages scratched into walls with sharp stones, bits of charcoal, or maybe just a finger dragged through soft plaster. Graffiti. In Pompeii, it's everywhere. On tavern walls, outside bathhouses, inside homes and workshops. These words weren't meant to be preserved. They were casual, quick, even careless. But when Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79 CE, it buried the city in ash and locked these messages in place, as if pressing pause on a moment that was never supposed to last. The very act of writing on walls in ancient Rome was as natural as breathing. Unlike today, where graffiti carries connotations of rebellion or vandalism, in Pompeii, it was simply another form of communication. The Romans had no newspapers, no social media, no bulletin boards in the modern sense. Instead, they had walls. Every surface became a potential canvas for human expression, a place where thoughts could be shared, arguments could be continued, and memories could be preserved. The walls themselves tell us about the materials people used. Some messages were carved deep into stone with metal tools, suggesting premeditation and effort. Others were scratched lightly with pottery shards or coins, quick thoughts captured in passing moments. The most ephemeral were written with charcoal or chalk, substances that would normally fade with time and weather. Only the catastrophic preservation of Vesuvius saved these fleeting words from disappearing forever. Some are names, simple declarations of presence. Julia was here. Cornelius loved Sabina. A child might have written one with pride, or a young man with hope. These declarations of presence speak to something fundamental about human nature. We want to be remembered. We want to mark our passage through the world. In Pompeii, this desire manifested in the simplest possible way. A name carved into plaster. But even these simple statements carry weight. Julia, whoever she was, succeeded in her modest bid for immortality. 2,000 years later, we know she existed, that she walked these streets, that she took the time to announce her presence to the world. The love declarations are perhaps even more poignant. Cornelius loved Sabina might seem like ancient graffiti cliché, but imagine the moment it was created. Perhaps Cornelius was a young man, newly smitten, who couldn't contain his feelings. Perhaps he carved it while waiting for Sabina outside her house. Or maybe he etched it into the wall of a tavern where they first met. Did Sabina ever see it? Did she blush, or laugh, or roll her eyes? Did their love story have a happy ending, or was it cut short by the mountain's fury? Others are more elaborate. There are love notes and insults, votes of confidence and bitter complaints. In a small house near the Forum, one reads, "I detest the lazy. May all idlers be struck down." A few steps away, someone else has replied, "Then may you be the first." This exchange reveals the conversational nature of Pompeii's graffiti culture. Walls weren't just repositories for individual thoughts. They were forums for debate, spaces where citizens could engage with each other across time. The anonymous respondent's witty comeback suggests that even in ancient times, people understood the power of the perfect retort. We can imagine the original writer's frustration at being so cleverly contradicted, or perhaps their grudging admiration for the quick wit of their unknown opponent. Political graffiti tells us about electoral campaigning in ways that formal histories never could. Unlike the carefully crafted inscriptions on monuments, these wall messages capture the raw energy of local politics. Vote for Marcus Holconius for Duumber. He's a good man, sits alongside. Lucius Popadius is a thief. Don't trust him with your taxes. Some messages were clearly organized campaigns, with similar slogans appearing across multiple walls in the same handwriting. Others were spontaneous endorsements or attacks, the ancient equivalent of yard signs and attack ads. The electoral graffiti also reveals the democratic participation of groups, often excluded from formal politics. Women, laborers, and non-citizens might not have had official votes, but they had voices, and they used the walls to express their political preferences. The mule drivers request the election of Gaius Julius Polybius as Duumvir, shows how professional guilds organized their support, while Caprasio with her neighbors recommends Lucius Caius Secundus, demonstrates how women participated in the political process, despite their legal exclusion from voting. Some graffiti is practical, notices of events, or tally marks beside gambling scores. In one tavern, a customer has written, "We drank here until dawn." Another below responds, "And you still owe me 3 denarii." These practical messages transform the walls into a primitive information network. Before official posting boards, before newspapers, before any formal system of public announcements, there were walls. Gladiator fights were advertised with crude drawings and basic details. 20 pairs of gladiators will fight on the nones of May. Market days were announced, lost items were described, and found objects were claimed. The gambling tallies are particularly revealing. They show us not just that Romans gambled, but how they gambled. The careful scratches and marks suggest systematic record keeping, perhaps for games that lasted hours or days. Some marks are crossed out, suggesting debts paid or bets settled. Others remain open, frozen in time, like so many other aspects of life in Pompeii. The tavern conversations painted on walls give us insight into Roman social drinking culture. Unlike modern bars where conversation is ephemeral, Roman taverns became repositories of memorable exchanges. "We drank here until dawn" isn't just a boast. It's a record of friendship, of time well spent, of connections made over wine and conversation. The response about the 3 denarii debt adds a layer of realism. Even in their cups, the Romans were keeping track of money owed and favors granted. Even the bathhouses, with their mosaics and steamy rooms, weren't safe from scribbled words. One reads, "I had a good time here." Another says, simply, "Beware of the thief in the red tunic." The bathhouse graffiti opens a window into Roman social life at its most relaxed. The baths were more than just places to get clean. They were social clubs, business centers, and gossip mills. The graffiti reflects this multifaceted role. Expressions of pleasure and satisfaction sit alongside warnings about pickpockets and thieves. Some messages are clearly meant for friends. "Marcus, meet me at the 3rd hour in the hot room." Others are public service announcements. The masseur in the East Wing overcharges. The bathhouse walls also contain some of the most explicitly sexual graffiti in Pompeii, though these messages reveal more about Roman attitudes toward sexuality than modern sensibilities might expect. What we might consider shocking was often matter of fact to Romans. Their graffiti about sexual encounters is frequently straightforward, sometimes boastful, occasionally humorous, but rarely shameful. This contrast highlights how different cultures constructed different meanings around the same human experiences. Religious graffiti appears throughout the bathhouses as well. Small prayers scratched into walls, appeals to gods for good health or successful business ventures, expressions of gratitude for safe travels. These intimate spiritual moments, preserved in such public spaces, remind us that Romans lived with their gods in ways that permeated every aspect of daily life. There are deeper glimpses, too. Fragments of poetry, lines from plays, half-finished thoughts. One message reads, "Nothing lasts forever," which feels haunting now, carved into a wall that outlasted its writer by nearly 2,000 years. The literary graffiti of Pompeii reveals an unexpectedly literate population. Lines from Virgil's Aeneid appear on multiple walls, sometimes quoted perfectly, sometimes creatively modified. Ovid's love poetry shows up in bedrooms and taverns. Even Homer appears, usually in Latin translation, suggesting that Greek literature remained part of Roman education and culture. But it's the original compositions that truly capture the imagination. Amateur poets tried their hand at love elegies, composing verses that range from touching to terrible. "My heart burns with passion, like Vesuvius burns with fire," might seem prophetic now, but it was probably just a young man's overwrought attempt at romantic verse. Other original poems are more successful, showing genuine talent and creativity. The philosophical graffiti is perhaps the most intriguing. Stoic maxims appear alongside Epicurean celebrations of pleasure. "Nothing lasts forever" might be a translation of a Greek philosophical text, or it might be an original observation by someone contemplating the temporary nature of human life. Either way, it demonstrates that philosophical thinking wasn't confined to schools and academies but filtered down into everyday consciousness. Some messages seem to be memory exercises, perhaps by students practicing their rhetoric or recitation. Lines from speeches appear incomplete, as if someone was trying to remember the full text. Educational graffiti suggests that even informal spaces served as classrooms, where students might practice their lessons or teachers might illustrate their points. The graffiti speaks to us because it wasn't meant to. These weren't official records or carefully sculpted epitaphs. They were passing thoughts. Jokes, boasts, arguments, even advertisements. Together, they form a chorus of everyday voices that history usually forgets. Official Roman history comes to us through the words of emperors, senators, and generals. We know about military campaigns, political alliances, and administrative policies. But the graffiti of Pompeii gives us something else entirely. The voices of ordinary people living ordinary lives. The baker who wanted to advertise his bread, the young woman who wanted to proclaim her love, the tavern customer who wanted to remember a good night with friends. These voices create a different kind of historical record. Instead of the grand narratives of rise and fall, we get the small stories of daily life. Instead of the carefully constructed rhetoric of public speech, we get the spontaneous expressions of private thought. Instead of the official version of events, we get the popular response, the street-level interpretation, the common person's perspective. The democracy of the walls is perhaps their most remarkable feature. In a society stratified by class, gender, and legal status, the walls offered a space where anyone who could write could have their say. Laborers wrote alongside citizens, women alongside men, children alongside adults. The physical act of writing on a wall required no permission, no official sanction, no formal approval. It was free speech in its most literal sense. And then there are the drawings. Crude sketches of gladiators and animals, outlines of ships, or caricatures of politicians and teachers. Some are playful, others a little mocking. On one wall, a stick figure stands beside a Latin insult that roughly translates to, "He thinks he's smart, but can't spell." The visual graffiti of Pompeii adds another dimension to our understanding of ancient communication. Not everyone who had something to say could write, but almost everyone could draw. The crude sketches and stick figures represent the voices of those who might have been excluded from textual communication, but still wanted to participate in the conversation. Gladiator drawings are among the most common and most carefully executed. These aren't casual doodles, but detailed portraits showing specific fighters, their equipment, and their fighting styles. Some drawings include names, suggesting they were advertisements or tributes to popular gladiators. Others show fight scenes with winners and losers clearly marked, perhaps commemorating particularly memorable matches. The animal drawings range from realistic to fantastical. Dogs and cats appear frequently, sometimes with names scratched nearby. Horses are common, often shown in profile with careful attention to their proportions. More exotic animals like elephants and lions appear as well, perhaps reflecting the impact of the beast hunts in the amphitheater. Ship drawings cluster around the harbor areas, drawn by sailors, merchants, or simply by people who made their living from the sea. These sketches often show remarkable detail, including rigging, sails, and even cargo. Some seem to be records of particular ships, perhaps drawn by homesick sailors or by merchants tracking their investments. The caricatures are perhaps the most entertaining. Politicians appear with exaggerated features, teachers with oversized heads, and various local personalities with their distinguishing characteristics amplified for comic effect. These drawings reveal a culture comfortable with satire and irreverence, where even authority figures could be mocked in public spaces. The combination of text and image creates some of the most complex graffiti messages. A drawing of a phallus might be accompanied by a name, creating either a boast or an insult, depending on the context. A portrait of a gladiator might include a poem about his prowess. A sketch of a ship might be labeled with its destination or its captain's name. Inside what is believed to be a bakery, someone etched a loaf of bread into the plaster. Next to it, a name. Perhaps it was a signature, or perhaps it was a joke. Either way, the loaf is still there, long after the oven went cold. This image in the bakery captures something essential about Pompeii's graffiti culture. Here was someone, perhaps the baker himself, perhaps a customer, perhaps just someone passing by, who felt moved to create a permanent record of something as temporary as bread. The careful etching suggests this wasn't a casual moment, but a deliberate act of creation. The bread drawing might have been advertising, a way of marking this establishment as a place where good bread could be found. It might have been pride, a craftsman's signature on his workspace. It might have been humor, an inside joke between baker and customer. Or it might have been something else entirely, a symbolic gesture whose meaning we can only guess at. What makes this particular graffiti so powerful is its ordinariness. Bread was the most basic food in the Roman world, the foundation of every meal, the standard by which prices were measured. Yet someone thought this humble loaf worthy of artistic representation. In that simple drawing, we see the elevation of the everyday, the transformation of the mundane into art. The name beside the bread drawing adds another layer of mystery. Is it the baker's name, claiming credit for his craft? Is it a customer's name, marking a favorite establishment? Is it the artist's name, signing his work? Without context, we can only speculate, but the speculation itself is part of the charm. These graffiti messages are puzzles from the past, fragments of stories we'll never fully know. Even in tragedy, the words linger. On one street, a series of messages seem hurried, scratched over one another. Some historians believe they were made in the final hours, as the ash began to fall and panic spread. The words are hard to read, but they speak of fear, of gods, of last thoughts. The final hour graffiti represents some of the most poignant messages in all of Pompeii. As the mountain exploded and ash began to fall, some people's instinct was still to write, to leave a record, to communicate with whoever might come after. These messages are often fragmented, sometimes overlapping, written in haste as the disaster unfolded. Some of these final messages are prayers, desperate appeals to gods for protection or mercy. Jupiter, save us, appears in several locations, sometimes repeated multiple times, as if the writer was trying to make sure the god heard. Other divine names appear as well, Neptune, Venus, Mercury, even Egyptian and Eastern gods, whose cults had spread throughout the Roman world. Family names appear in these final messages too. "Tell my wife" begins one fragment, though the rest is lost. "My children" appears at another, followed by illegible marks. These incomplete messages are among the most heartbreaking in all of Pompeii, representing final thoughts that were never fully expressed, love that was never fully communicated. Some of the final graffiti seems to be attempts at record keeping, as if people wanted to leave an account of what was happening. "The mountain burns" appears in one location. "Ash falls like rain" in another. These weren't artistic expressions, but documentary efforts, attempts to bear witness to the unprecedented disaster unfolding around them. The physical evidence of these final messages is as important as their content. The scratches are often deeper, more urgent, carved with whatever tools were available. The handwriting is shaky, hurried, sometimes barely legible. In some cases, messages were started but never finished, as if the writer was overcome by events before they could complete their thought. And yet, much of the graffiti is simple, even joyful. A reminder that ancient people lived with the same small dramas, jokes, and longings we still know. They were proud of their accomplishments, annoyed with their neighbors, and hopeful about their romances. The joyful graffiti of Pompeii might be the most important of all, because it reminds us that life in the ancient world wasn't defined by the tragedies we remember. Most of the time, people were simply living, falling in love, making friends, pursuing their careers, raising their children, enjoying their leisure time. The graffiti captures this ordinary happiness in ways that formal histories never could. Celebration messages appear throughout the city. Marcus passed his rhetoric exam is carved into a wall near the Forum. Lucius's shop made a profit today appears near the market district. The baby took his first steps is scratched into a house wall. These aren't the great events that historians record, but they were the great events in individual lives. The humor in Pompeii's graffiti reveals a culture that appreciated wit and wordplay. Puns appear frequently, often relying on double meanings that don't translate well into modern languages. Jokes about names, occupations, and personal characteristics show a society comfortable with teasing and banter. Even the insults often have a playful quality, suggesting they were part of ongoing friendly rivalries rather than serious attacks. Achievement graffiti shows people taking pride in their accomplishments, both large and small. Craftsmen signed their work, students recorded their successes, athletes celebrated their victories. These messages reveal a culture that valued excellence and recognized it publicly. The walls became a kind of informal resume system where people could advertise their skills and accomplishments. The romantic graffiti goes far beyond simple declarations of love. Elaborate courtship messages appear, with suitors trying to impress their intended with clever wordplay or poetic skill. Marriage announcements are carved into walls, sharing happy news with the community. Even divorce messages appear, though these are rarer and usually more bitter in tone. Walking through Pompeii's quiet streets, reading these walls, you begin to feel the city not as a ruin, but as a place briefly paused. The stalls are closed, but you can imagine the smell of fresh bread. The bathhouses are silent, but you can almost hear splashing water. And the walls still whisper with all the things their people left behind. The sensory experience of reading Pompeii's graffiti is impossible to ignore. These messages weren't meant to be read in museums or books, but in their original context, surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of daily life. The bread message makes more sense when you're standing in a bakery, imagining the heat from the ovens and the aroma of fresh loaves. The tavern conversations become more vivid when you're in the space where wine was poured and friends gathered. The physical act of creating these messages is also part of their meaning. Someone had to stop, find a tool, and take the time to carve or scratch their words into the wall. This wasn't quick or easy work. It required commitment, a belief that the message was worth preserving. Every mark represents a moment when someone decided their thought was important enough to make permanent. The accumulation of messages on single walls creates a kind of time-lapse effect. Messages from different years, different seasons, different days layer on top of each other. New graffiti appears next to old, creating conversations across time. The walls become palimpsests, documents that have been written and rewritten, reflecting the ongoing life of the community. The preservation of these messages by Vesuvius creates a unique historical situation. Normally, graffiti would fade, be painted over, or be worn away by weather. But the volcanic ash froze these messages in time, preserving not just the words, but the moment they were written. We can see the tools that were used, the pressure that was applied, even the order in which letters were carved. The democracy of preservation is also significant. The ash didn't discriminate between important and unimportant messages. Grand political proclamations were preserved alongside trivial personal notes. Love letters received the same treatment as shopping lists. This random preservation gives us a more complete picture of ancient life than any deliberate archive could provide. Modern visitors to Pompeii often comment on the immediate connection they feel to these ancient voices. The graffiti bridges the gap between past and present in ways that formal monuments cannot. When you read "Marcus Loves Livia" carved into a wall, you're not learning about ancient civilization in an abstract sense. You're connecting with Marcus himself, sharing his joy and hope across 2,000 years. The emotional impact of the graffiti is heightened by its preservation in tragedy. These casual messages, never intended to last, have become the most enduring legacy of their creators. The irony isn't lost on modern visitors. The most permanent words in Pompeii are those that were meant to be most temporary. Contemporary graffiti artists sometimes see Pompeii as a validation of their own work. The messages on these ancient walls prove that the impulse to write on walls is as old as writing itself. They demonstrate that graffiti has always been a form of human expression, a way for people to claim space and voice in the world around them. The scholarly study of Pompeii's graffiti has revealed new insights into ancient literacy, social structure, and daily life. The sheer volume of messages suggests that literacy was more widespread than previously thought. The participation of women, laborers, and other marginalized groups in the graffiti culture indicates that writing skills extended beyond the elite classes. The linguistic analysis of the graffiti has also been revealing. The casual nature of the messages preserves examples of spoken Latin that don't appear in formal literary texts. Slang terms, regional dialects, and colloquial expressions give us insight into how ordinary Romans actually spoke. The mistakes and misspellings are as valuable as the correct usage, showing us how the language was evolving at the street level. The archaeological context of the graffiti provides additional layers of meaning. Messages found in specific locations tell us about the function of different spaces and the types of people who used them. The graffiti becomes another form of material culture, as informative as pottery shards or architectural remains. Now, as we leave these voices suspended in time, we turn our attention to something else. Beyond the bustle and the chatter, behind the locked doors and quiet fountains, there were Romans living very differently. The transition from the democratic voices of the walls to the privileged silence of the elite represents one of the most dramatic shifts in Roman society. While ordinary citizens carved their thoughts into public walls, the wealthy lived in spaces where such casual expression was unnecessary. Their voices were preserved in other ways, through formal letters, commissioned artwork, and architectural grandeur. But the contrast goes deeper than just different forms of expression. The graffiti represents a world where public space was shared, where walls belonged to everyone, where communication was open and democratic. The elite world we're about to enter was characterized by privacy, exclusivity, and carefully controlled access. Where the walls of Pompeii's streets were open books, The walls of elite homes were blank canvases for expensive art. The silence that characterized elite spaces wasn't empty, but full of different meanings. It was the silence of servants who moved without speaking, of business conducted in whispers, of power that didn't need to announce itself. It was the silence of people who didn't need to carve their names into walls, because their names were already known, already recorded, already permanent. Yet even in this world of privilege and privacy, the human need for expression and connection remained. The elite had their own forms of graffiti, their own ways of leaving messages for posterity. But these took different forms: expensive frescoes that told personal stories, elaborate gardens that reflected individual tastes, collections of art and literature that expressed sophisticated sensibilities. The wealthy Romans who lived in Pompeii's grandest houses were as human as the people who wrote on the walls. They too fell in love, worried about their children, celebrated their successes, and feared their failures. But their social position gave them different ways of expressing these universal experiences. Instead of scratching messages into plaster, they commissioned poets to write verses. Instead of drawing pictures on walls, they hired artists to create masterpieces. The archaeological evidence suggests that even the elite were not immune to the democratic appeal of wall writing. In some of the grandest houses in Pompeii, graffiti appears in servant quarters, in private gardens, even occasionally in formal reception rooms. The impulse to write on walls was so strong that it penetrated even the most controlled environments. The multilingual nature of Pompeii's graffiti reveals the cosmopolitan character of this ancient city. Latin dominates, but Greek appears frequently, sometimes in the same message as Latin words. Oscan, the ancient local language of Campania, surfaces occasionally, usually in older sections of the city. Egyptian hieroglyphs appear in a few locations, probably left by visitors or merchants from Alexandria. Even Celtic words show up, scratched by soldiers or traders from Gaul. This linguistic diversity tells us that Pompeii was a crossroads, a place where cultures met and mingled. The graffiti writers switched between languages with casual fluency, sometimes within the same sentence. A love poem might begin in Latin and end in Greek, or a business message might use Latin numbers with Greek words. This code switching suggests a population comfortable with multiple languages, a skill that would have been essential in Mediterranean commerce. Foreign graffiti also reveals the temporary nature of much of Pompeii's population. Sailors left messages in their native tongues, merchants scratched notes in the languages of their home cities, and soldiers carved their names in the dialects of their legions. These messages create a map of the ancient world, showing us the connections between Pompeii and places as distant as Britain and Egypt. Some of the most intriguing graffiti appears in what archaeologists call waiting spaces, areas where people had time to kill. The entrance halls of public buildings, the benches outside shops, the shaded porticos where business was conducted, all became canvases for those who lingered. These messages often have a meditative quality, as if the writers were using the time to reflect on their lives. "I have waited here for 3 hours" appears in several locations, sometimes followed by creative expressions of boredom or frustration. "The merchant never comes on time," complains one message near the forum. "My feet hurt from standing," observes another near the amphitheater. These waiting room graffiti capture the tedium that punctuated ancient life, the long stretches of time between more exciting moments. The seasonal nature of some graffiti adds another dimension to our understanding. Messages about harvest festivals, religious celebrations, and athletic competitions are clustered around specific times of year. "The grain ships have arrived" appears in autumn messages. "Time for the Vinalia" shows up in spring graffiti. These seasonal markers help us understand the rhythm of life in ancient Pompeii, the way natural cycles shaped social activities. Weather comments appear throughout the graffiti, revealing how climate affected daily life. 3 days of rain appears in several winter messages. "The heat makes work impossible," shows up in summer graffiti. Perfect sailing weather appears near the harbor in spring and fall. These casual meteorological observations remind us that ancient people were far more dependent on weather than we are today. The graffiti also reveals the importance of reputation in Roman society. Names appear in contexts that suggest either praise or blame. Lucius is honest in his dealings, contrasts with, "Beware of Gaius, he cheats at dice." These character references served as an informal credit system, helping people navigate business relationships in a world without formal consumer protection. Professional pride appears throughout the graffiti. "Best garum in Campania made here," boasts a fish sauce producer. "My bread won the competition," celebrates a successful baker. "Fastest ship in the harbor," claims a merchant captain. These professional advertisements show how skilled craftsmen and merchants used the walls to build their reputations and attract customers. The children's graffiti deserves special attention because it shows us how the young learn to participate in literate culture. Practice letters appear in many locations, often shaky and uncertain. Simple words and phrases suggest children testing their writing skills. Names are common, as if young people were proud to demonstrate their ability to write their own identities. School exercises appear scratched into walls near educational buildings. Lines of poetry, mathematical calculations, and rhetorical exercises show students practicing their lessons. Some of these academic graffiti include corrections, suggesting that teachers use the walls as impromptu blackboards. The casual mixing of education and public space reveals how learning happened throughout the city, not just in formal classrooms. The graffiti of Pompeii's workshops and factories tells us about working conditions and labor relations. "The boss is fair" appears in some locations, while "he works us too hard" shows up in others. "Good pay for good work" suggests satisfaction with working conditions. "The water boy is lazy" reveals workplace tensions. These labor-related messages give us insight into the daily experiences of working people in ways that formal records never could. Trade-specific graffiti appears in different parts of the city. Near the harbor, messages about cargo, shipping schedules, and foreign ports dominate. In the textile district, notes about wool quality, dyeing techniques, and fashion trends appear. Around the metalworking shops, technical discussions about alloys and techniques are scratched into walls. Each profession had its own concerns, its own vocabulary, its own network of communication. The medical graffiti is particularly fascinating because it shows how health and healing were understood in the ancient world. "The doctor saved my life" appears near what may have been a medical practice. "This herb cures headaches," shares folk remedies. "Broken arm healed well" celebrates successful treatment. These medical messages reveal both professional healing and popular medicine, showing how health knowledge circulated through the community. Religious diversity appears throughout the graffiti, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of the Roman world. Traditional Roman gods dominate, but Eastern deities appear frequently. Isis, Mithras, and Cybele are mentioned alongside Jupiter and Venus. Jewish symbols appear in a few locations, and what may be early Christian references have been tentatively identified. This religious pluralism shows a society where different beliefs coexisted, sometimes uneasily, but generally peacefully. The festival graffiti captures the celebratory spirit of Roman religious life. Great Games this year celebrates successful gladiatorial shows. The procession was magnificent, praises a religious parade. Free bread for everyone announces public generosity. These celebration messages remind us that Roman religion was as much about community joy as personal devotion. The graffiti even records natural phenomena that caught people's attention. Strange lights in the sky appears in several locations, possibly describing meteor showers or aurora displays. The earth shook twice, records seismic activity. A two-headed calf was born, notes unusual livestock births. These natural observations show how people tried to make sense of their world through careful attention to unusual events. Personal reflection appears in some of the most moving graffiti. "I miss my father," expresses grief. "Tomorrow I will be brave," shows someone preparing for a challenge. "Life is short but sweet," offers philosophical consolation. These intimate moments, preserved by chance, connect us most directly to the emotional lives of ancient people. The graffiti of Pompeii's gardens and outdoor spaces has a different character from indoor messages. Surrounded by nature, writers seemed more contemplative, more philosophical. "The roses bloom beautifully this year," celebrates natural beauty. "Here I found peace," marks a favorite spot. "The fountain sings," offers poetic observation. These outdoor messages suggest that Romans, like us, found solace and inspiration in natural settings. As we prepare to enter this world of whispered conversations and formal protocols, we carry with us the voices from the walls. They remind us that beneath the surface of any society, no matter how stratified or controlled, human expression finds a way to emerge. The graffiti of Pompeii's streets serves as a counterpoint to the formal culture of its elite. A reminder that history is made not just by the powerful, but by everyone who takes the time to leave their mark on the world. The cumulative effect of reading thousands of these messages is overwhelming. Each individual graffito might seem trivial, but together they create a symphony of human experience. They transform Pompeii from a collection of ruins into a living community, from an archaeological site into a place where real people lived, worked, loved, and died. In their preserved voices, we hear not just the past, but the eternal human present, the ongoing conversation between generations that connects us all. Let's now step away from the crowded streets and into the calm rhythm of luxury, where servants moved silently across mosaic floors and soft light flickered through shaded atriums. We're entering the world of the Roman elite, where life moved more slowly, and where wealth created a different kind of silence. Here, in these private spaces, we'll discover how the other half lived, how power expressed itself not through public proclamation, but through private refinement, and how the same human desires that drove people to write on walls found expression in forms both subtle and magnificent. Now we leave behind the narrow streets and crowded apartments. The chatter of the markets and the warm graffiti on Pompeii's walls begin to fade. Ahead of us stands a high wall, smooth and quiet, concealing the world within. Beyond it lies a domus, the private home of one of Rome's patrician families. At first glance, the exterior gives away very little. A plain doorway sits inside a blank facade, easy to pass by without much notice. But stepping through, everything begins to change. Inside, the noise of the city softens into stillness. The atrium opens before you, a wide reception hall centered beneath a rectangular opening in the roof. Rainwater falls through this space into a shallow pool below. The walls around you are painted in vivid detail, with shades of red and gold, deep blue, and soft green. Scenes from mythology, gardens, and heroic stories surround you. These painted walls tell stories within stories. Here, Perseus holds the head of Medusa, his bronze shield catching painted light that seems to dance with the real shadows cast by the afternoon sun. There, Venus emerges from foam-capped waves, her figure rendered with such delicate attention that visitors often pause mid-conversation to study the artist's technique. The pigments themselves speak of wealth and connections. The deep blues made from lapis lazuli, carried across desert trade routes. The brilliant reds from cinnabar mined in distant Spanish hills. The lustrous gold leaf applied so carefully that it catches even the gentlest flicker of oil flame. In one corner of the atrium, a small household shrine stands quietly. It holds tokens and offerings to the family's guardian spirits. There might be a dried garland resting there, a few coins, or the gentle scent of yesterday's incense still lingering in the air. The presence of these household gods is quiet but constant, part of the rhythm of everyday life. This lararium, as it is known, represents far more than simple superstition. The small bronze figurines arranged upon its shelves connect this family to generations of ancestors, to the founding stories of Rome itself, and to the daily protection sought by every household, from the greatest palace to the humblest apartment. Fresh flowers are placed here each morning, selected from the garden by the domina herself or by her most trusted slave. The floor under your feet is made of tiny stones set into patterns. Some are simple, others incredibly intricate. Sea creatures, vines, and birds seem to move beneath your steps. Everything is arranged with care, but never loudly so. The house is meant to impress, but only in the softest way. These mosaics represent months or even years of patient labor. Skilled craftsmen, many of them Greek laborers or freedmen, worked section by section to create these floors. The process began with careful drawings on papyrus, scaled and proportioned to fit the exact dimensions of each room. The tesserae, the small colored stones, were cut by hand from marble quarried in distant mountains, from volcanic rock gathered near Vesuvius, from precious stones imported from Egypt and Asia Minor. Further inside, the garden awaits. This space, called the peristyle, is open to the sky and surrounded by graceful columns. It is carefully tended, with clipped hedges and potted trees lining the paths. A small fountain trickles in the center. The water sound is steady and calm. Birds flutter in the vines along the outer walls, and the scent of herbs rises with the late afternoon warmth. The peristyle garden represents the Roman ideal of bringing nature under human control while maintaining its essential beauty. Every plant here has been chosen for specific qualities. Bay laurel for its association with victory and honor, rosemary for remembrance and loyalty, thyme for courage, mint for hospitality. The garden serves as both a practical space for growing herbs and medicines, and a symbolic representation of the family's ability to create order from chaos, civilization from wildness. Water is the garden's beating heart. The fountain at its center is fed by an elaborate system of pipes and channels that bring fresh water from the city's aqueducts directly into the home. The sound of flowing water serves multiple purposes. It masks conversations from potential eavesdroppers, it cools the air during hot summer days, and it creates a sense of constant renewal and life. Around the fountain, carefully tended flower beds bloom in succession throughout the year. The paths winding through the garden are paved with stones that complement the mosaics inside the house. These walkways are wide enough for comfortable strolling, but narrow enough to create intimacy and encourage quiet conversation. This is where time begins to stretch out. Meals are not rushed, but unfold across hours. Guests recline on cushioned couches, and servants bring small dishes one by one. Olives, cheeses, soft bread, roasted vegetables, and fruits from the countryside. Wine is poured gently. Conversation flows in quiet tones, and candles flicker softly along the walls. The dining experience in a patrician home transforms eating from mere sustenance into an art form that engages all the senses. The triclinium, or dining room, is carefully designed to accommodate the Roman custom of reclining while eating. The couches, built to precise specifications, are arranged in a U-shape around low tables, allowing for easy conversation while maintaining social hierarchies through seating arrangements. The serving vessels used during these meals represent the pinnacle of Roman decorative arts. The progression of dishes follows ancient customs and seasonal availability. The meal begins with gusttatio, appetizers designed to stimulate the palate and encourage conversation. The main course, called the prima mensa, features the finest ingredients the family can obtain. The preparation of these dishes requires skilled cooks who understand both the technical aspects of cooking and the social significance of food presentation. Wine service follows elaborate protocols that reflect both the quality of the vintage and the importance of the occasion. Conversation during these meals follows its own rhythms and customs. The lighting during these evening meals creates an atmosphere of warmth and intimacy. Music might accompany these meals, provided by skilled slave musicians who have trained in the Greek tradition. In one corner of the home, someone is reading. A scroll is unrolled carefully, each line followed with patience. It may be poetry, philosophy, or letters from a friend in another province. Reading here is not about speed. It is about reflection. The library of a patrician home represents both personal pleasure and public status. The scrolls stored here, carefully organized on wooden shelves or in cedar chests, represent the accumulation of knowledge and culture that defines Roman civilization. These texts are not merely books, but treasured possessions, each one copied by hand by skilled scribes. The subjects of these scrolls reflect the breadth of Roman intellectual life. Letters from friends and family members throughout the empire form another important category of reading material. The physical act of reading in the ancient world requires different skills than modern reading. The room where this reading takes place is designed to support extended periods of concentration and reflection. The reader's personal library reflects not only their interests, but also their social connections and cultural aspirations. Children learn in shaded rooms not far away. Tutors guide them through Latin, Greek, geometry, music, and public speaking. Their voices are soft, sometimes barely above a whisper. The domus values knowledge, just as it values beauty and order. The education of children in a patrician household represents one of the family's most important investments in the future. The rooms dedicated to learning are carefully designed to create an atmosphere conducive to study and reflection. The walls might be decorated with maps of the known world, portraits of great writers and philosophers, and inscriptions featuring memorable quotations from classical authors. The furniture is scaled to accommodate both children and adults, with writing desks, reading chairs, and storage for books and writing materials. The tutors who provide this education are typically highly educated laborers or freedmen who have been carefully selected for their knowledge and teaching ability. Many are Greeks, for Greek culture is still considered the pinnacle of intellectual achievement. These educators often possess knowledge that rivals or exceeds that of their patrician employers, but their social status requires them to serve rather than lead. The relationship between tutor and student is complex, involving elements of authority, affection, and mutual respect. The curriculum followed in these private schools reflects the Roman ideal of producing citizens, capable of serving the state in various capacities. Latin literature forms the foundation of this education, with students memorizing long passages from Virgil's Aeneid and other classical works. This memorization serves multiple purposes. It provides students with a vast vocabulary and understanding of sophisticated language structures. It fills their minds with examples of noble behavior and moral reasoning, and it connects them to the cultural heritage that defines Roman civilization. Greek language and literature occupy an equally important place in this education. Students learn to read Homer's epics, Plato's dialogues, and the plays of Sophocles and Euripides. This bilingual education ensures that Roman children can participate fully in the intellectual life of the Mediterranean world, where Greek remains the language of scholarship and philosophical discourse. Mathematics and geometry are taught not merely as abstract subjects, but as practical skills essential for managing estates, conducting business, and understanding the natural world. Students learn to calculate areas and volumes, to understand proportion and symmetry, and to apply mathematical principles to real-world problems. The geometric principles that underlie Roman architecture and engineering are explored through hands-on projects and detailed drawings. Rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, receives particular attention in patrician education. Students learn to construct logical arguments, to use language effectively for different purposes, and to present themselves with confidence and dignity. They practice by delivering speeches on historical topics, arguing both sides of controversial questions, and memorizing famous orations by Cicero, and other masters of Roman oratory. Music education provides both practical skills and cultural refinement. Students learn to sing, to play instruments such as the lyre and flute, and to understand the mathematical principles underlying musical harmony. Music is considered essential for developing sensitivity to rhythm, proportion, and beauty, qualities that will serve students well in all aspects of life. The teaching methods used in these private schools emphasize patient repetition, gradual progress, and individual attention. Lessons begin early in the morning when minds are fresh and distractions are minimal. Students work on writing exercises, copying passages from classical authors, while paying careful attention to handwriting, spelling, and grammar. Reading aloud is practiced regularly to develop clear speech and confident presentation. The relationship between students and tutors often extends beyond formal lessons. Tutors serve as mentors and advisors, helping students navigate the complex social and moral challenges of growing up in a patrician household. They provide guidance on behavior, ethics, and the responsibilities that come with privilege and social position. The physical environment of these learning spaces is designed to minimize distractions while maximizing comfort and focus. The rooms are oriented to receive natural light for most of the day, reducing the need for artificial illumination that might strain young eyes. The temperature is kept comfortable through careful attention to ventilation and the use of braziers during cold weather. The acoustic properties of the rooms are considered as well, for much of the learning involves spoken recitation and discussion. Writing materials used in these educational settings represent a significant investment in the children's future. Papyrus for daily exercises, parchment for more important work, reed pens, metal styluses, and wax tablets all serve different purposes in the learning process. The quality of these materials reflects the family's commitment to providing the best possible education for their children. Assessment and progress monitoring follow established patterns that have been refined over generations of Roman education. Students demonstrate their learning through recitations, written exercises, and presentations to family members and guests. The ability to quote appropriate passages from classical authors, to construct logical arguments, and to present oneself with dignity and confidence are all signs of educational success. Every sound in the home seems measured. The brush of sandals on mosaic floors, the scrape of pottery on stone, the splash of water in a basin, even the rustle of a curtain feels part of a carefully tuned world. Yet behind all this quiet is constant motion, held in balance by invisible labor. The acoustic environment of the domus is as carefully designed as its visual elements. The materials used in construction, the proportions of rooms, and the placement of furnishings all contribute to creating specific sound qualities in different spaces. In areas meant for conversation, such as the atrium and triclinium, surfaces and proportions are chosen to support clear speech without creating distracting echoes. In private quarters, sound-absorbing materials and careful layout ensure privacy and quiet. The sounds of daily life in the domus follow predictable patterns that reflect the rhythms of Roman domestic culture. The morning begins with the soft sounds of laborers preparing the house for the day. The gentle splash of water being poured for washing, the quiet scrape of tools being arranged, the whispered conversations of servants coordinating their activities. These sounds are deliberately muted, for the laborers understand that their efficiency depends partly on their ability to work without disturbing the family. As the day progresses, the sounds shift to reflect the activities of the patrician family. The rustle of fine fabrics as the domina moves through the house, the soft slap of leather sandals on stone floors, the gentle clink of jewelry and decorative objects all contribute to the atmosphere of refined domesticity. When guests arrive, the sounds expand to include conversation, laughter, and the various noises associated with hospitality. The pouring of wine, the arrangement of furniture, the presentation of food. The evening brings its own soundscape. Oil lamps are lit with the soft scrape of flint and the gentle whoosh of flames catching oil. Dinner conversation creates a low murmur punctuated by laughter and the quiet sounds of eating and drinking. Music, when present, adds another layer to the acoustic environment, with the delicate tones of string instruments weaving through the other sounds. The water features throughout the house create a constant background of gentle sound. The trickling of fountains, the splash of water in basins, and the flow of water through the house's plumbing system provide a steady, soothing backdrop to all other activities. This water music serves practical purposes as well, masking potentially intrusive sounds from the street and creating acoustic privacy for conversations. The materials used in the house's construction contribute significantly to its acoustic character. The hard surfaces of marble and stone reflect sound crisply, creating clear echoes in large spaces like the atrium. Soft furnishings, including curtains, cushions, and carpets, absorb sound and create more intimate acoustic environments in smaller rooms. The careful balance between hard and soft surfaces allows for both public grandeur and private intimacy within the same structure. The positioning of rooms within the house follows acoustic as well as visual principles. The most private spaces are located farthest from the street, protected by multiple layers of intervening rooms and courtyards. The sounds of the city, while never completely eliminated, are filtered and softened by the time they reach the inner sanctums of the domus. This acoustic separation reinforces the sense of refuge and tranquility that the house is designed to provide. Even the timing of activities within the house follows patterns that consider acoustic harmony. The noisiest activities, such as food preparation and house cleaning, are scheduled for times when they will least interfere with the family's leisure and rest. The laborers who perform these tasks have learned to work efficiently while minimizing noise, using techniques passed down through generations of domestic service. The acoustics of the house also reflect social hierarchies and cultural values. The spaces where the paterfamilias receives clients and conducts business are designed to project authority and command attention. The acoustic properties of these rooms enhance the speaker's voice and create an atmosphere of importance and gravity. In contrast, the spaces used for relaxation and family life are designed to encourage intimate conversation and quiet reflection. Laborers work from before sunrise until nightfall. They tend the garden, maintain the lamps, prepare the meals, clean the walls and floors, and care for the children. Their movements are practiced and quiet. Their presence is essential, yet rarely acknowledged aloud. The stillness of the domus is not natural. It is managed. The slave system that makes possible the refined lifestyle of the Patrician domus represents one of the fundamental realities of Roman society. The dozens of laborers who work in and around the house form a complex hierarchy with specialized roles and responsibilities. Their coordinated efforts create the appearance of effortless luxury while concealing the intensive labor required to maintain such a lifestyle. The day begins for these laborers well before dawn, as they must prepare the house and its amenities before the family awakens. The kitchen laborers rise first, rekindling fires that have been banked overnight and beginning the preparation of the day's meals. The water system must be checked and maintained, ensuring that fresh water flows to all parts of the house. The garden laborers examine their charges for any overnight damage or changes that require attention. The house laborers responsible for cleaning and maintenance begin their work while the family sleeps. They sweep and wash floors, dust furniture and decorative objects, trim lamp wicks and refill oil reservoirs, and ensure that every surface in the house meets the exacting standards expected by their owners. This work requires not only physical effort, but also detailed knowledge of the proper care for different materials and objects. The personal laborers who serve the family directly have perhaps the most demanding roles. They must be available at all times to respond to their owner's needs, yet they must also be skilled in reading moods and anticipating requirements. The laborers who dress the domina must understand the social significance of different clothing choices and jewelry combinations. Those who serve the paterfamilias must be knowledgeable about his business affairs and social obligations. The educational laborers who work with the children occupy a unique position in the household hierarchy. Their knowledge and skills may exceed those of other laborers, but their responsibilities are equally demanding. They must not only teach academic subjects, but also serve as moral guides and cultural transmitters, helping to shape the next generation of the patrician class. The coordination of all these activities requires sophisticated management and communication systems. The villicus, or household manager, typically a trusted slave or freedman, oversees the work of other laborers and ensures that all tasks are completed efficiently and on schedule. This management role requires organizational skills, personal authority, and detailed knowledge of the family's preferences and requirements. The living conditions of these laborers vary considerably depending on their roles and the favor they enjoy with their owners. The most valued laborers may have comfortable private quarters, adequate food and clothing, and opportunities for education and advancement. Others may live in crowded conditions with minimal amenities. All laborers, regardless of their treatment, exist in a state of legal and social vulnerability that colors every aspect of their lives. The economic value of these laborers represents a significant portion of the family's wealth. Skilled laborers, particularly those with specialized knowledge or abilities, command high prices in the slave markets. The investment in maintaining and training laborers is substantial, creating powerful incentives for owners to protect and develop their human property. The psychological and social dynamics of the slave system create complex relationships between owners and laborers. Some laborers develop genuine affection for their owners and take pride in their work and accomplishments. Others endure their situation with stoic resignation or carefully concealed resentment. The most fortunate laborers may eventually earn or purchase their freedom, becoming freedmen with continuing obligations to their former owners. The training of laborers begins early and continues throughout their lives. Young laborers learn basic skills and household routines from older, more experienced laborers. This informal education system ensures that knowledge and techniques are passed down through generations, maintaining the high standards of service that patrician families expect. The health and welfare of laborers receive attention not only for humanitarian reasons, but also for economic ones. Sick or injured laborers cannot work effectively, so maintaining their health serves the owner's practical interests. Some households employ slave doctors or have access to medical knowledge that helps prevent and treat illnesses. The security arrangements for managing large numbers of laborers require careful planning and constant vigilance. While outright rebellion is rare, the potential for theft, sabotage, or escape is always present. The household's organization includes various checks and balances designed to prevent problems while maintaining efficiency. The integration of slave labor into every aspect of household life creates a situation where the comfort and convenience of the free family depends entirely on the coordinated efforts of their human property. This dependence is so complete that many patrician Romans cannot imagine life without extensive slave labor, leading to a society where such inequality is accepted as natural and necessary. And still, for those who live inside, the home feels timeless. It is a place set apart from the daily pressures of the city. Within these walls, Rome becomes an idea of peace, stability, and order. Evenings arrive gently. Oil lamps glow one by one. A final cup of watered wine is shared. Then doors are closed, and the house folds into sleep. The evening transformation of the domus marks the daily transition from public engagement to private retreat. As the sun sets and the sounds of the city begin to fade, the house gradually shifts into its nocturnal rhythm. The laborers move through their final tasks of the day, securing the house against the night and preparing for the family's rest. The lighting of the evening lamps follows a carefully orchestrated sequence. Beginning with the public areas and working toward the private quarters, laborers kindle dozens of oil lamps throughout the house. The warm, flickering light creates an atmosphere of intimacy and comfort, while the gentle scent of burning olive oil adds to the sensory richness of the evening environment. The final meal of the day, often a lighter affair than the elaborate midday dinner, provides an opportunity for the family to gather and reflect on the day's events. The conversation at these evening meals tends to be more personal and reflective, focusing on family matters rather than public affairs. The wine served is typically mixed with a higher proportion of water, creating a mild drink suitable for the evening's peaceful mood. The family's evening activities reflect the Roman values of reflection, education, and cultural refinement. Reading continues by lamplight, with family members taking turns reading aloud from favorite works. Music might be played softly, creating a background for conversation or meditation. The children of the household might demonstrate their learning by reciting poetry or discussing topics from their studies. The physical preparation for sleep involves rituals that have been refined over generations. The laborers responsible for personal care help family members change into sleeping garments, typically simple tunics made from soft linen or wool. Hair is unpinned and brushed, jewelry is removed and carefully stored, and feet are washed in preparation for rest. The bedrooms of the domus are designed to provide maximum comfort and security during the vulnerable hours of sleep. The beds themselves are substantial pieces of furniture, often made from expensive woods and fitted with complex systems of ropes and straps to support mattresses. The mattresses are stuffed with wool, feathers, or other soft materials and covered with fine linens or silks. The arrangement of the sleeping quarters reflects both practical considerations and social hierarchies. The paterfamilias and his wife occupy the most secure and comfortable bedroom, typically located in the interior of the house, away from potential street noise or intrusion. The children's rooms are positioned to allow for supervision while providing appropriate privacy. Guest rooms are prepared to accommodate visitors with honor and comfort. The security of the house during the night hours requires careful attention to multiple details. The outer doors are secured with heavy bronze locks and reinforced with iron bars. The household laborers responsible for night security make regular rounds, checking locks, and ensuring that all is well. The guard dogs, if the family keeps them, are released to patrol the garden and outer areas. The transition to sleep is gradual and peaceful. The oil lamps are extinguished one by one, beginning with the public areas and working toward the private quarters. The final lamp to be extinguished is typically in the master bedroom, marking the official end of the household's active day. The house settles into quiet, with only the gentle sounds of water features and the occasional movement of night guards to break the silence. The quality of sleep in the domus is enhanced by the careful attention paid to creating optimal conditions for rest. The rooms are designed to maintain comfortable temperatures throughout the night, with provisions for heating during cold weather and cooling during summer heat. The acoustic properties of the bedrooms minimize disturbing sounds while allowing for the security of being able to hear unusual noises. The dreams and rest of the patrician family are protected not only by physical security, but also by spiritual practices. Prayers are offered to the household gods for protection during the night, and amulets or religious symbols are often placed near the beds to ensure peaceful sleep. The Romans believed that sleep was a time of particular vulnerability, when the soul was partially separated from the body and more susceptible to supernatural influences. The morning awakening begins the cycle anew, as the house gradually returns to life with the rising sun. The laborers are already moving through their pre-dawn routines when the first light filters through the compluvium, casting gentle shadows across the atrium floor. The sound of water being poured for washing, the soft scrape of tools being prepared, and the whispered coordination of the day's activities create a subtle symphony that welcomes the new day. The Domina's morning ritual begins with a careful selection of clothing and jewelry appropriate for the day's activities. Her personal laborers understand not only her preferences, but also the social significance of different choices. The color of her stola, the arrangement of her hair, and the selection of her jewelry all communicate messages about her status, her family's position, and her intentions for the day. The paterfamilias begins his day with a review of the household accounts and correspondence that arrived during the night. His personal secretary, typically an educated slave or freedman, has already organized the day's business and prepared summaries of important matters requiring attention. The morning consultation with the household manager ensures that all domestic affairs are proceeding smoothly and that any problems are addressed before they can disrupt the family's routine. The breakfast meal is typically simple but carefully prepared. Fresh bread from the household ovens, honey from the family's own beehives, cheese from their rural estates, and fruits from the garden provide nourishment without the elaborate ceremony of the evening meals. The family gathers in the sunny spaces of the house, taking advantage of the morning light and the cool temperatures before the heat of the day begins. The children's morning routine combines personal care with the beginning of their educational activities. Their pedagogues, the laborers responsible for their overall development, guide them through washing, dressing, and preparation for the day's lessons. The transition from sleep to learning is gradual and supportive, recognizing that young minds require careful nurturing to develop properly. The garden awakens with the family as the night-blooming flowers close their petals and the day-blooming varieties begin to open. The fountain's sound seems fresher in the morning air, and the birds that nest in the vines begin their daily course. The gardening laborers check for any overnight damage from weather or pests and make adjustments to ensure that the garden will look perfect when the family begins to use the space. The morning light streaming through the compluvium creates constantly changing patterns on the mosaic floors and painted walls. The colors that seemed muted in the lamplight of evening now glow with renewed vibrancy, and the artistic details that might have been overlooked in the dimmer light become clearly visible. The house itself seems to come alive with the dawn, revealing new beauties and confirming the wisdom of its design. Now, as we step away from these gardens and painted halls, we return to the larger rhythm of the city. From the quiet domus to the crowded Insula, from street scribbles to imperial struggles, Rome moved forward in 1,000 different ways. The contrast between the serene world of the Patrician domus and the hung, bustling energy of the city streets creates a fundamental tension in Roman life. The wealthy retreat to their private sanctuaries, but they cannot entirely escape the broader currents of urban existence. The laborers who serve them come from the same crowded neighborhoods we explored earlier. The food that graces their tables travels through the same markets where ordinary Romans struggle to make their purchases. The water that flows through their fountains comes from the same aqueducts that serve the entire city. Yet this tension between private luxury and public complexity is not merely a matter of economic inequality. It reflects deeper questions about the nature of Roman civilization itself. The refined culture of the domus depends on the labor and resources of the broader empire. The philosophical discussions that take place in Patrician gardens are made possible by the military conquests that bring wealth and laborers to Rome. The artistic achievements that decorate these homes draw on traditions and techniques developed throughout the Mediterranean world. The laborers who maintain these households carry with them memories and knowledge from their places of origin. A Syrian slave might introduce new cooking techniques to the kitchen. A Greek slave might bring philosophical ideas into the educational program. A Germanic slave might contribute practical skills learned in the northern forests. In this way, the seemingly isolated world of the domus becomes a center where cultures from throughout the empire meet and blend. The children being educated in these privileged environments will eventually take their place in the broader world of Roman society. Some will pursue military careers, leading legions in distant provinces. Others will enter politics, serving as magistrates and senators. Still others will focus on business, managing the commercial enterprises that sustain the empire's economy. Their education in the quiet halls of the domus prepares them for engagement with the wider world. The women of these households, while constrained by social expectations, also play crucial roles in connecting the private world of the family with the public sphere of Roman society. Through their marriages, their patronage of artists and writers, and their influence on their children's education, they help shape the cultural and political directions of the empire. The seemingly domestic world of the Domus becomes a space where the future of Rome is nurtured and developed. The economic foundation that supports this lifestyle depends on connections that extend far beyond the walls of the house. The family's wealth might come from agricultural estates in the countryside, from commercial ventures in distant ports, or from mining operations in conquered territories. The maintenance of these enterprises requires constant communication and coordination with agents and managers throughout the empire. The political implications of this lifestyle are equally complex. The leisure that allows for philosophical reflection and artistic appreciation is made possible by the subjugation of millions of people throughout the empire. The security that permits such refinement depends on the constant vigilance of the legions stationed along the frontiers. The cultural achievements celebrated in these homes are built on foundations that many would consider morally questionable. Yet the residents of these houses are not merely passive beneficiaries of imperial exploitation. Many use their wealth and influence to support public works, to patronize artists and scholars, and to provide for the welfare of their communities. The tradition of Roman public service, however imperfect, creates expectations that privilege must be balanced with responsibility. The architectural and artistic achievements that we have observed in the Domus represent technological and creative advances that benefit society more broadly. The engineering techniques developed for domestic water systems contribute to the public aqueducts that serve all Romans. The artistic styles pioneered in private homes influence the decoration of public buildings and temples. The educational methods refined in patrician households eventually spread to benefit children from less privileged backgrounds. The literary and philosophical works read in these private libraries become part of the broader cultural heritage that defines Roman civilization. The conversations that take place in these gardens and dining rooms generate ideas that influence law, government, and social policy. The seemingly private world of the Domus becomes a laboratory for developing the intellectual and cultural innovations that will shape the future of the empire. As we prepare to close our journey tonight, let's take a moment to reflect on everything we've seen. The progression from the crowded streets and graffiti-covered walls to the serene courtyards and painted halls of the Domus has revealed the extraordinary complexity of Roman urban life. We have witnessed a society that combines unprecedented luxury with grinding poverty, sophisticated culture with brutal exploitation, architectural magnificence with urban squalor. The tensions and contradictions we have observed are not merely historical curiosities, but fundamental aspects of the Roman experience. The voices we have heard, from the street vendors hawking their wares to the children reciting poetry in patrician homes, remind us that history is ultimately about human experiences. The graffiti scratched into walls speaks of loves and losses, hopes and frustrations that transcend the centuries. The elaborate meals and philosophical discussions in the Domus reflect universal human desires for beauty, comfort, and meaning. The physical spaces we have explored, from the cramped apartments of the Insulae to the spacious gardens of the Domus, demonstrate how environment shapes human behavior and aspirations. The Romans understood that architecture and urban planning could influence social relationships and cultural development. The careful design of both public and private spaces reflects sophisticated thinking about how human communities should be organized. The economic and social systems we have observed reveal both the achievements and the limitations of Roman civilization. The ability to create and maintain such complex urban environments represents a remarkable organizational accomplishment. Yet the dependence on slave labor and the extreme inequality between rich and poor raise questions about the sustainability and morality of this system. The cultural achievements we have witnessed, from the artistic decorations of humble shops to the literary discussions in Patrician libraries, demonstrate the human capacity for creativity and intellectual development, even in challenging circumstances. The Romans' ability to absorb and adapt influences from throughout the Mediterranean world while maintaining their own distinct identity offers lessons about cultural diversity and integration. The technological innovations we have encountered, from the engineering of the aqueducts to the sophisticated heating systems in private homes, show how human ingenuity can improve the conditions of daily life. The Romans' practical approach to solving urban problems created solutions that would influence city planning for centuries to come. As we step back from these intimate glimpses into Roman life, we carry with us a deeper understanding of how ordinary people lived, worked, and dreamed in one of history's most influential civilizations. The echoes of their voices, the shadows of their daily routines, and the remnants of their built environment continue to inform our understanding of urban life, social organization, and human nature itself. But our journey through Rome's social landscape has revealed only part of the story. Beyond the domestic realm of the domus, beyond the commercial bustle of the streets, lies another world entirely. In the next segment of our exploration, we will venture into spaces where the very foundations of Roman power were contested and confirmed, where the empire's most fundamental decisions were made, and where the future of the known world was shaped by the ambitions and conflicts of those who claimed to speak for Rome itself. The quiet luxury of the patrician home, for all its refinement and beauty, was ultimately sustained by forces that operated in very different spaces, following very different rules, and serving very different purposes in the pursuit of domestic tranquility and cultural refinement. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. From the swaying beams of the Roman Insula to the shifting loyalties of a city in crisis. From the casual words etched into Pompeii's crumbling walls to the quiet trickle of fountains inside a patrician's garden. A long, slow walk through the layered rhythms of life in ancient Rome. If you're still awake, thanks for staying with me all the way to the end. And if you drifted off somewhere between the creaking staircases and the whispering atriums, that's perfectly fine too. That's kind of the whole idea. If you enjoyed this slower, sleep-friendly journey through the past, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it was when you pressed play. I always enjoy seeing where in the world these late-night history walks are reaching. For now, I'll let the sound of sandals on stone fade into silence. Let the oil lamps burn low, and let the distant hum of the ancient city drift quietly out of reach. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.